My father's gambling debt made me the bride of the most feared mafia boss in the underworld. Her father didn't lose her in a card game. He sold her, months before that night, in a back room that smelled like cigarettes and broken promises. And every tear he cried when the men came to collect was a performance he had rehearsed. Elena Ashcroft didn't know that yet. She only knew the cold, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, and the fact that the man waiting for her at the end of that long marble hallway was described by people who had survived him as something that existed beyond the reach of mercy. She walked toward him anyway, because she thought she was saving her father. That was her first mistake, and it would not be her last. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. Isgamt. The rain that night came down the way bad news always does, sideways, hard, and at the worst possible moment. Elena had been working a double shift at the copy center on Merritt Street when her phone rang the first time. She ignored it. The laminator was jammed. A client was standing at the counter with the patience of a man who had never once been inconvenienced in his life, and she had exactly $47 in her checking account until Friday. She didn't have the bandwidth for whatever her father was calling about. The second call she silenced. The third call came from a number she didn't recognize, and something in her stomach pulled the way it always did when the universe was about to hand her something she hadn't asked for. She answered. The voice on the other end was quiet, professionally quiet, the kind of quiet that people practice. He didn't introduce himself. He just said her name, her full name, Elena Marie Ashcroft, and then said her father was currently in a building on the south end of the Haverfield district, and that she should come alone and come quickly if she wanted him returned in the condition she remembered. She asked who was speaking. He said it didn't matter yet. She asked if her father was alive. A pause. He's coherent, the man said, which was not the same thing as alive, and they both understood that. She left without clocking out. Her manager called after her, but she was already pushing through the glass door into the rain, and the sound of her name being shouted from inside the copy center felt like a noise from another dimension, some parallel version of her life where the biggest problem was an unjammed laminator and a difficult client. She was already beyond that version. She just didn't know by how much. The address she'd been given resolved into a parking structure 3 stories underground, the kind that smelled like exhaust and standing water, and decisions made without enough information. She drove there in her 12-year-old Civic with the cracked dashboard and the heater that only worked when it felt like it, and she sat in the car for almost 2 full minutes before she got out. Not because she was afraid. She was afraid, absolutely. The fear was physical. It lived in her throat and the palms of her hands. But the 2 minutes were calculation. She was thinking about whether there was any version of this situation where her father came out of that building on his own and she never had to walk inside. She couldn't find one. She got out of the car. 2 men were waiting near the stairwell. Not the theatrical kind of muscle she'd expected. No visible weapons, no posturing. They were just men in dark clothing who watched her approach with the patient attention of people who do this for a living and find it neither exciting nor particularly burdensome. One of them held out his hand for her phone. She hesitated. "It comes back to you," he said. She gave it to him. They didn't blindfold her, which she initially took as a good sign, and later understood meant something else entirely. That it didn't matter what she saw because the question of what she would do with that information had already been decided by someone else. The interior of the building had been transformed in the way that only money and intent can transform a space. Not renovated exactly, but claimed. The raw concrete walls remained, but the furniture placed against them was quiet and expensive, the lighting deliberately low, the whole atmosphere arranged to communicate a specific thing, that the person who occupied this space was not trying to impress anyone, and that fact alone should impress you considerably. She was walked through 2 sets of doors and then into a room that was larger than she expected, with a long table running the center of it and a single figure standing at the far end with his back to her, looking at something on the wall that she couldn't see from the doorway. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, without turning around. She didn't answer. Her eyes were moving around the room, cataloging exits, cataloging the other people present. 2 men standing near the right wall, one near the door she'd just come through. Her father was seated at the table, which she registered with a drop of relief so sudden it almost made her dizzy. He was pale, and the knuckles of his left hand were swollen, and his suit jacket, the brown one he wore when he felt the need to look respectable, was torn at the shoulder seam, but he was upright. He was breathing. His eyes found hers, and the expression on his face was one she recognized. The specific look of a man who knows he has gone further than the last time and is hoping that love is elastic enough to stretch that far. She had seen that look before. She'd been seeing it since she was 9 years old. The man at the far end of the table finally turned. Damien Viscari was not what the stories had prepared her for, and that was the most unsettling thing about him. She had expected something that matched the reputation, brutality made visible, a face designed to communicate danger. What she found instead was a man in his late 30s, composed to a degree that suggested the composure was structural rather than performed, wearing a dark suit that fit him with the precision of something custom-made and the carelessness of something thrown on. He was not conventionally handsome. His face was too angular for that, a jawline that could cut something, eyes the color of deep water in winter. Not dramatic, not cold in the theatrical sense, just genuinely neutral in the way that things with no natural predators can afford to be. A scar ran from the corner of his left eye to just below his cheekbone, thin and old, silver rather than pink. He looked at her the way she imagined cartographers once looked at uncharted coastlines, like something requiring accurate measurement. "Sit down," he said. "Where?" she said, because there were 14 chairs at the table and her father was in one of them, and the specific configuration felt like a test she hadn't been briefed on. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, adjacent to it. "Anywhere you're comfortable," he said. "I'm not comfortable." "Then it doesn't matter where you sit." She sat 2 chairs away from her father, close enough to touch him if she needed to, far enough to communicate that she hadn't decided yet what she thought of him being here. He reached toward her and she shifted slightly, and he pulled his hand back. The men near the wall tracked the exchange with the detached attention of people watching something they have no stake in. Damien Viscari sat down at the head of the table. He placed both hands flat on the surface, the gesture of a man who is about to say something true and wants you to know he's not reaching for anything. He looked at her father first, briefly, the way you look at a problem you've already solved and don't particularly need to revisit. Then he looked at Elena. "Your father owes this organization $430,000, he said. The debt accrued over approximately 18 months through a combination of credit extended in good faith and interest that accumulated when that credit was not serviced. I'm not going to explain to you how he arrived here because I suspect you already understand the mechanism and have for some time." She said nothing. He was right. She understood the mechanism. She'd been servicing the smaller debts for 3 years. The loan from her own savings, the money borrowed from her friend Carla that she hadn't fully paid back, the months she'd eaten rice and canned beans so she could wire money to cover whatever her father had managed to destroy most recently. 430,000 was the first figure that put her completely outside the range of any solution she could construct on her own. "I'm telling you the amount," Damien continued, "so you understand that what I'm about to offer isn't generosity. It's a transaction." Her father made a sound. "Damien, Thomas." The name landed like a door closing. Her father stopped. Elena watched this. She filed it. The ease of it. The fact that a single word from this man was apparently sufficient to halt whatever her father had been about to say. She filed the fact that Damien had used her father's first name, which meant they were not strangers, which meant this was not the first room they had occupied together. "The debt," Damien said, returning his attention to her, "will be cleared in full tonight, under one condition." She waited. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table between them, sliding it toward her slowly. It was a ring box. Matte black, no branding, no ribbon. It stopped 3 feet from her hands. The silence in the room was absolute. "I'm going to need a wife," Damien Viscari said, and the sentence came out with the same temperature and cadence as everything else he'd said, as though it were the most unremarkable sequence of words in the language. "You have 72 hours to give me an answer. If the answer is yes, the debt disappears and your father lives whatever life he chooses afterward. If the answer is no, I will give you 6 hours to leave this city, and then I will begin collecting what's owed to me by the only means left available." She stared at the ring box. "You're serious," she said. "I don't make offers I'm not serious about. You don't know me. I know enough." "That's insane." "Yes," he said evenly. "It is. That doesn't change the terms." She looked at her father. Thomas Ashcroft was 58 years old and looked 70, the years having compressed themselves into his face with the efficiency of someone who spent decades using his body to absorb punishment he'd manufactured himself. He was looking at her with the elastic hope she had been watching her whole life, the expression that said he believed she would find a way out because she always had. She always found a way out. Elena was the one who fixed things. Elena was the one who absorbed the impact so others didn't have to. She looked at the ring box. She thought about the $430,000. She thought about the 6 hours. She thought about what collecting by the only means available meant in the context of a man like this, in a room like this, with men like those standing near the walls. She reached across the table and picked up the ring box. She didn't open it. 72 hours, she said. 72 hours, he confirmed. She stood up. "I'm taking my father with me." A pause. The first genuine pause she'd observed from him. He looked at her steadily. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, "Thomas." Her father stood. He was unsteady on his feet, and she didn't offer him her arm, which he noticed, and which was the first honest thing she'd communicated to him all night. They were walked back through the 2 sets of doors, given her phone, and released into the parking structure. The rain had gotten worse. She got in the car, and her father got in the passenger seat, and for almost a full minute, neither of them said anything. The rain hit the roof of the Civic in sheets. The heater kicked on without prompting, which meant the night had entered the temperature range it preferred. "Elena, don't," she said. "I just want to explain." "I said don't." He was quiet. She drove him to his apartment on Crest Avenue, the one she'd been paying half the rent on for the past 14 months because his income was inconsistent and his needs were not. She pulled up to the curb and kept the engine running. He sat there for a moment with his hand on the door handle. "I didn't have any other options," he said. It was the thing he always said. It was the only sentence in his vocabulary for this particular occasion. "Go inside, Dad." He got out. She watched him climb the 3 steps to the door and fumble with his keys and disappear into the building. Then she sat in the car with the ring box on the passenger seat and the heater blowing lukewarm air at her face, and she thought about the word wife and the word 72 and the word enough. He knows enough. And she thought about what that meant and what it implied about how long someone had been watching her life from a distance she couldn't identify. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her apartment, a studio on the 4th floor of a building that had been meant as temporary housing 3 years ago and had become permanent through the slow accumulation of necessity. And she stared at the ceiling and listed what she knew. Damien Vescari. She had heard the name the way you hear sounds in the night, ambient and shapeless, something her father muttered once during a phone call he'd taken in the next room, something a colleague at the copy center had referenced obliquely in connection with a news story about a waterfront fire the previous spring. The name existed in the city the way certain things exist, present without advertising itself, significant without explanation. He ran something. He controlled something. The specifics were deliberately obscured by the kind of organizational architecture that only gets constructed by people who intend to remain obscure. She opened the ring box at 2 a.m, with the lamp on the nightstand throwing yellow light across her comforter. The ring was not what she expected. Not ostentatious, not the kind of thing designed to communicate wealth as the primary message. A single dark stone, garnet, she thought, though she wasn't certain, set in white gold, the band narrow and unadorned. It was the ring of someone who had specific taste rather than the ring of someone trying to make a point about resources. She stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the box. She had spent the next 36 hours attempting to find an alternative. She called her friend Carla, who was an attorney, not the criminal variety, but at least someone with legal instincts, and explained the situation in terms carefully vague enough that she could be describing a hypothetical. Carla was quiet for a long time and then said that if the situation were real and not hypothetical, the options were approximately as limited as Elena already suspected, and that the most important information to obtain would be whether this man had a reason beyond the stated one. Because men like this, she didn't say like this, but her pause communicated it, did not make the kind of offer being described without a specific and calculated purpose, and that purpose was worth understanding before any decision was made. Elena already knew this. She'd been thinking about nothing else. She called in sick to the copy center on the second day and drove to the public records office and spent 4 hours pulling everything publicly available that connected to the name Vescari. What she found was notable for what it didn't contain: no criminal record, no civil judgments, 3 business registrations in industries that were unremarkable on their surface: logistics, real estate holdings, a private security consultancy, a profile so clean it had the texture of something professionally maintained. She found a photograph from a charity event 6 years earlier, a fundraiser for the children's ward of a hospital whose name she recognized from the north side of the city. He was standing in the back of a group shot in a dark suit, not centered, not positioned as though he expected to be identified. He looked exactly as he had in that room, present without performing presence, which was perhaps the most unsettling quality she had encountered in another person. On the morning of the third day, with 11 hours remaining on the 72, Elena Ashcroft made a decision. She was not making it out of love or fascination or any of the things that the situation might have generated in a different kind of woman. She made it the same way she had made every significant decision since she was 19, by eliminating every option that left someone she cared about unprotected and then selecting from what remained. The only thing left was yes. So yes was what she would give him, but she intended to give it on her terms, or as close to her terms as the situation allowed. She drove back to the address from 3 nights ago. There was no parking structure entrance visible from the street, no signage, nothing to indicate the building was anything other than what it appeared, a former commercial property in a transitional district, unremarkable and unremarked upon. But there was a man she recognized from that night standing near a door on the east side of the building, and when she approached and said she was there to see Damien Vescari, he made a call, and 3 minutes later she was escorted inside. This time the room was different, smaller. A study, perhaps, or the kind of space that functioned as multiple things depending on the need. Bookshelves on one wall, real books, not decorative. She could tell by the condition of the spines. A desk. 2 chairs that weren't the disposable kind. Damien was standing when she entered, which she noticed because she hadn't expected standing. "You have 4 hours left," he said. "I'm aware." "You have an answer." "I have an answer, and I have conditions." Something moved in his expression. Something she couldn't name, not quite surprise, something that functioned like reassessment. He gestured toward one of the chairs. She sat. He sat across from her. "Say the conditions," he said. She had written them out the night before. Not because she needed the paper, but because writing things down was how she ensured she didn't lose her nerve at the critical moment. She didn't take the paper out. She had memorized it. "My father's debt is cleared in writing, with documentation I can keep. Not a verbal confirmation, not a promise. Documentation." He nodded. "I continue my own financial independence. I maintain my accounts, my employment, if I choose it, my ability to come and go without an escort under ordinary circumstances." "Define ordinary," he said. "Circumstances where the security concern is one you manufacture to control my movement rather than one that genuinely exists." A pause. "Acceptable," he said, "with the caveat that there are circumstances I'm not in a position to fully explain in advance, and in those circumstances, I'll ask you to trust the precaution before I can explain it." She studied him. "And if I decide the precaution isn't warranted? Then we'll have a disagreement, and I'll explain my reasoning." It was not the answer she had expected. She moved on. "I want access to information about this organization commensurate with my position within it. I'm not willing to be someone who lives inside something they can't see." This one produced a longer pause. "Some of it," he said finally. "Not all of it. There are things that knowing would put you in more danger, not less. I want to be the judge of that threshold. You're not in a position to judge that threshold yet. You don't have the context. He met her eyes and held them. That's not a dismissal. It's a fact about where we are right now. In 3 months, 6 months, a year, we can revisit what you need to know. She didn't like this answer. She also recognized it as probably true. Fine, she said. Last condition. This arrangement, whatever it is, remains honest. I don't care what it looks like on the outside. On the inside, between the two of us, I want honesty, even if the honest thing is inconvenient. The pause this time was different, not a calculation, something else. Agreed, he said. And then, with a weight she didn't entirely understand, that's one I would have required myself. She reached into her coat pocket and put the ring box on the desk between them. Then, yes, Elena Ashcroft said. My answer is yes. Damien Vescari looked at the ring box for a moment. Then he reached across and opened it himself. And he looked at the ring the way you look at something you've kept for a long time, something with more history than its size would suggest. He closed the box and slid it back toward her. The ceremony is in 6 days, he said. Small, private. My people and 2 witnesses of your choosing. I want Carla Reyes, she said. Fine. And I want to tell her the truth. A beat. How much of it? As much as she needs to be there for me without pretending I'm happy. He looked at her for a long moment. Reyes stays in the inner circle from that point forward. I need you to understand what that means for her. Elena understood. She thought about Carla in her sensible office clothes, her color-coded filing system, her absolute inability to let a wrong go unchallenged. She thought about what this world would do to someone like that, and whether it was her right to drag Carla into its orbit. I'll explain the exposure to her, Elena said. Let her decide. That's fair. The meeting was over in less than 20 minutes. She was escorted back out through the east door, back into a morning that was overcast but no longer raining, the streets wet and reflective and smelling like concrete warming in thin sunlight. She sat in her car and thought about the word wife again, and the word yes, and the expression on his face when she'd said the last condition, the honesty one, and how something in his jaw had shifted in a way she couldn't categorize. She drove back to her apartment. She had 6 days to prepare for a marriage she had entered voluntarily and couldn't fully explain to herself. She called Carla. She told her everything she knew. Carla was silent for a full minute, and then she said, I'm going to need more coffee, and you need to start from the beginning. Elena started from the beginning. The wedding was held on a Wednesday morning in the ground floor of a building in the Aldermore district that appeared from the outside to be a private club of some kind, the kind that doesn't have a sign. Inside, it was warmer than expected, with wood paneling and flowers Elena hadn't ordered, but that appeared to have been selected by someone with a specific understanding of what she wasn't. Not white roses, not lilies, but deep ranunculus in burgundy and rust, the kind of flowers that suggested someone had thought about it. There were 11 people present, not counting the officiant. Elena knew 2 of them. She stood next to Damien Vescari in a dress she'd bought from a consignment shop on Prentice Street and paid for with her own money because that felt important, and she listened to the words being spoken and said the words she was supposed to say, and felt the ring being placed on her finger with a steadiness that didn't tremble. Afterward, Damien's hand rested briefly at the small of her back as they turned to face the room, and it was the first time he had touched her, and it was so understated that she almost didn't notice it, except that she noticed it completely. Carla, standing 3 feet away, had the expression of a woman holding approximately 17 different reactions in careful containment. She caught Elena's eye and communicated something with her eyebrows that roughly translated to, "We are going to have a very long conversation about this later." Elena communicated back, "I know." That night, she was brought to Damien's estate for the first time. She had expected a compound, walls, gates, the architecture of paranoia. What she found was a property that sat behind significant gates, yes, but the house itself was a converted manor, 4 stories, old stone, ivy at the north corners, the kind of building that had existed for a long time and had been maintained rather than renovated, so that it retained the weight of its own history without wearing it as ornamentation. Her rooms were on the 3rd floor. Rooms, plural, a detail that she registered as either consideration or distance and wasn't sure which. A sitting area, a bedroom, a bathroom that was larger than her entire previous apartment. The closet had space in it that didn't belong to her. A few things had been placed there that suggested someone had tried to anticipate her needs without knowing exactly what they were. She stood at the window of the sitting room and looked out at the grounds and thought about the word enough again. He knows enough. A knock at the door. She turned. The man who entered was in his 50s, compact and careful moving, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of watchfulness into something almost expressionless. He introduced himself as Marcus Hale, head of household security, and that if she needed anything, his extension was on the card he placed on the table by the door. He said it without warmth and without coldness, in the tone of someone delivering accurate information to someone who would need it. "Is there anything else you require tonight, Mrs. Viscari?" he said. The name hit her like stepping off a curb she hadn't seen. "No," she said. "Thank you." He left. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ring on her hand and listened to the house settle around her. Old houses settle, they breathe. They make noise in the walls from the expansion and contraction of wood and stone that has been doing this for generations. It wasn't an unpleasant sound. It was the sound of something old and solid that had survived things it wasn't going to explain. She had been in the house for less than 3 hours when she heard the glass break. Not inside the house. Outside, below her window, toward the east garden. A sharp percussive crack followed by silence, followed by running footsteps, followed by shouting in a language she didn't recognize. She was at the window before she had consciously decided to move. Below, in the pale security lighting, she could make out 3 figures moving fast across the garden, and then 2 more moving to intercept them, and then Damien Viscari crossing the garden at a pace that wasn't running exactly, but covered ground faster than it should have for how controlled it looked, and he was saying something sharp to the men around him. It was over in less than 90 seconds. The figures were contained. The shouting stopped. Damien looked up at her window. He had not looked up because he was checking on her. He had looked up because he was conducting a damage assessment of a tactical situation, and she was in the area being assessed. But their eyes met through 20 feet of night air and lit window glass, and his expression said something she couldn't translate, something that moved too fast to capture. And then he looked away and continued giving instructions to the men around him. She stepped back from the window. She thought about what Carla had said on the phone during that very long conversation. Find out what he wants you for, Elena, specifically, because a man like that doesn't acquire things he doesn't have a use for. She thought about the security around this house, the layers she'd already identified in the hours since she arrived. She thought about the incident that had just happened in the East Garden. 3 people who had come over a wall to reach this property, this house, specifically. She thought about Damien's face when he'd said, "I know enough," and the quality of certainty in it. She thought about the ring on her finger with the garnet stone and the narrow white gold band, and the way he'd looked at it before he'd given it to her, the way you look at something with more history than its size would suggest. Someone had not wanted her to simply be out in the world. And she was only now beginning to understand that the danger she had walked into by marrying this man might be considerably smaller than the danger she had been in before she ever met him. Her door opened without a knock. Damien stood in the doorway. He looked at her standing in the middle of the room and said, "You should stay away from the windows tonight." "What was that?" she said. A pause, the kind she was beginning to recognize as the pause before a decision about how much was true versus how much was useful. "A test," he said. "Someone checking the perimeter." "Who's someone?" "Not mine." She held his gaze. "You said you'd be honest." Something shifted in his jaw. "It's complicated in ways I'm not ready to explain tonight." That wasn't the agreement. "No," he said. It wasn't. He stepped into the room and pulled the door nearly closed behind him, not all the way, just enough to reduce the acoustic range of the hallway. He looked at her steadily. "Someone sent those men to confirm you were here. Not to hurt you tonight. To confirm location. Which means whoever sent them already knew you were coming, possibly before you knew yourself. I'm working on identifying the source." She let that settle. "Someone inside your organization," she said. He said nothing, which was the same as yes. And that's why you looked up at the window, she said. You weren't checking on me. You were checking whether whoever sent them had managed to do something while the attention was on the garden. The thing moved in his expression again. The reassessment. Yes, he said. Is there a camera in this room? No. My word on that. Is there one in the hallway? Yes. She thought about this. So you can't tell me everything in this room because the hallway is watched, but you can tell me some things because this room isn't. That's correct? That's a significant design choice for a room you put your wife in. Yes, he said, and something in the word carried the weight of an explanation she didn't have the context for yet. She sat down in the chair nearest the window, away from it as he'd asked, but facing it so she could see. Old habit, she didn't like to sit with her back to things. Go handle whatever you need to handle, she said. We'll talk tomorrow. He looked at her for a moment. The expression on his face was not warm, not cold, not reassured. It was something that functioned like the careful attention of a person encountering something unexpected in a situation they thought they'd fully prepared for. Good night, Elena, he said. Good night, she said. He left. The door clicked almost all the way shut. She sat in the chair in the near dark with the sound of the old house settling around her, and the east garden below now quiet and lit and empty, and she thought about layers. Layers of what was said, layers of what was left out, layers of whatever this situation actually was beneath the surface of what she'd been told. She was inside something. She understood that clearly. What she didn't yet understand was its shape, its reach, or who had built it, and for what purpose. She reached up and touched the ring on her finger. Somewhere below her, a door opened and closed. Voices, low, urgent, the specific cadence of men who are accustomed to bad news and working through it without panic. She couldn't make out words. She wasn't meant to. She thought about what Damien had said. Someone inside his organization had already known she was coming here before she'd known it herself. She thought about her father and the call that had arrived at the copy center and how precisely timed everything had been. The 72 hours, the controlled sequence of pressure and release, the way each element had been constructed to produce one outcome and one outcome only. She thought, this was not improvised. She thought, someone designed this. And then, with the cool clarity that comes from a mind that has been cleaning up after catastrophe since it was 9 years old and learned by necessity to see the structure underneath the wreckage, she thought, and whoever designed it knew exactly who I was long before my father sat down at that table. The house settled. The security lights in the garden cast long shadows across the stone. Elena Ashcroft, Elena Viscari, sat in the dark and started counting what she knew. It was the only thing she had. But she had always been better at arithmetic than anyone gave her credit for, and she intended to start collecting variables until the equation resolved. She just didn't know yet that the answer was going to change everything she thought she understood about her own life. She didn't sleep until almost 4 a.m, and when she did, it was the shallow, defensive kind of sleep that leaves you more tired than you started, the kind where part of your brain stays lit up and watchful even while the rest of it goes through the motions of rest. She woke at 6:15 to gray light coming through the curtains and the sound of the house already moving, footsteps on the floor below. The distant mechanical sound of something in the kitchen, voices too low to parse. She lay still for a moment and listened to the architecture of the morning, trying to understand what normal sounded like in this place, what the baseline was, because you can only identify an anomaly if you know what the regular rhythm feels like. Then she got up, washed her face with cold water, dressed in the clothes she'd packed herself, dark jeans, a gray pullover, the kind of clothes that said nothing about her and that she'd chosen deliberately for that quality, and went downstairs. The kitchen was large and functional rather than designed, the kind of kitchen that served a staff as much as a household, and there were 2 people in it when she arrived, a woman in her 40s who was moving between the counter and the stove with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this in this specific space for a long time, and Marcus Hale, who was standing near the east-facing window with a coffee cup and a tablet and the expression of a man reviewing information that wasn't improving his morning. Both of them looked at her when she entered. Mrs. Viscari, Marcus said. Elena, she said, please. He didn't acknowledge the correction either way. He gestured toward the coffee with a slight tilt of his cup, and she took that as an invitation and found a mug and poured from the carafe on the counter. The woman at the stove, Elena would learn her name was Petra, that she had been with the household for 11 years, that she was constitutionally incapable of letting a person stand in her kitchen without feeding them, placed a plate on the counter without being asked. Eggs, toast, the no-nonsense kind. "Thank you," Elena said. Petra made a sound that communicated she wasn't doing it for thanks. Elena stood at the counter and ate and watched Marcus Hale's eyes move across whatever was on his tablet and thought about what Damien had said last night about someone inside the organization. She looked at Marcus Hale, who had been head of household security for she didn't know how long. Long enough to know where every camera was. Long enough to know the layout of the East Garden and its blind spots. He looked up and caught her looking at him. "Mr. Vescari asked that you meet him in the study at 8, he said. "Where is that?" "I'll take you." She ate the rest of the eggs and didn't ask any more questions and filed the fact that Marcus Hale had not offered to take her anywhere the night before, had given her a card with an extension number and left her to orient herself in a house she'd never been in, and now this morning he was offering to escort her. Something had shifted in the operational posture of this household between last night and this morning, and she didn't know yet whether that shift was in her favor. The study was on the second floor, different from the room where Damien had met with her 3 nights ago. Smaller and more lived in. A desk with actual work on it, not the performative absence of work. 2 computer monitors showing things that went dark when she entered. Shelves with a combination of files and books that had the mixed-use look of a space where thinking happened rather than appearances were managed. Damien was standing. He looked like a man who had not slept, but wore it the way some people wear exhaustion. Not as depletion, but as fuel. Something burning in place of rest. He looked at her when she came in, and she thought she saw the very brief inventory of someone checking a variable. Is she frightened? Is she angry? Is she making plans she hasn't told me about? And she met it without expression. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Last night," he said, "the 3 men in the garden. I have 2 of them. The third got out." "What did the 2 say?" A pause. "They said they were paid to confirm your presence and report back." "Paid by who?" "That's what I'm working on." He moved to the desk, not sitting, just placing his hand on the surface. The same gesture she'd seen at the table the first night. The hands flat gesture, the "I'm not reaching for anything" posture. "I want to tell you something because you asked for honesty, and I intend to keep that." She waited. "The marriage was not my first solution," he said. "It was my last. There are other ways I could have managed your father's situation. Ways that would have resolved the debt and left you entirely outside this house, and outside my—" He paused, choosing the word, "orbit." "I chose this solution for reasons I'm not going to explain today, because the explanation requires context you don't have yet. But I want you to know that I understand what it costs, and that I didn't choose it carelessly." She looked at him for a long time. "That's not the same as explaining your reasons. No, it's not. It's you telling me you had reasons without telling me what they are." "Yes." That's close to honesty without being honesty. Something shifted in his jaw. "You're right, it is." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to hold the question for a short time, not forever. A short time." She considered this. It was not what she wanted. It was also more than she'd expected. The acknowledgement of the gap, the naming of it, which was a form of honesty even if it wasn't the full thing. "How short?" she said. "Days, not weeks." She moved to the chair across from the desk and sat, not because she was comfortable, but because standing felt like a posture of impermanence, and she had decided, somewhere between the eggs and the second floor, that she was not going to conduct herself in this house as though she expected to be removed from it at any moment. "Tell me about the organization," she said. "Not the parts you're protecting, the parts I need to know to function here without being a liability." He looked at her with an expression she was starting to learn, the one that said she had said something he hadn't anticipated and was recalibrating. He sat down. He talked for almost 40 minutes. Not everything. She could identify the perimeters of what he left out by the way certain sentences ended fractionally sooner than their own logic required. But enough. The organization operated across three primary channels: protection arrangements with legitimate businesses that functioned as a form of parallel insurance in areas where formal legal enforcement was unreliable, financial services of the informal variety, the kind that didn't require credit scores or declared income, and a logistics infrastructure that she understood was the load-bearing wall of everything else, and that he described in terms abstract enough to be legally deniable and specific enough that she understood its scope. There were 41 people in his direct employ who lived on or near the property at various times. There were approximately 200 more in the extended network across the city. There was, he said, a rival organization. He called them the Serrano Group, which was a name rather than a person, a collective, a consortium of interests that had been consolidating under a single operational umbrella for the past 4 years. They had been expanding into territory that had previously been his, not through violence primarily, but through the specific kind of economic pressure that looks like competition until it doesn't. 3 months ago, that had changed. The pressure had become personal. The methods had become direct. She listened to all of this and said, "Where does my father's debt fit into this?" Damien stopped. It was the pause she had come to recognize as significant, not the calculation pause, the other one. "Your father's relationship with this organization is older than his debt," he said. She felt the floor of the conversation shift. "How old?" 7 years. 7 years. She had been 17. She ran the arithmetic against her memory. 7 years ago, she had been in high school. Her father had been in the specific middle period of his gambling addiction, where things were bad but not yet catastrophic, before the loan from her savings, before the wire transfers, before the calls from numbers she didn't recognize asking for Thomas Ashcroft in voices that made clear the request was not a request. "He came to us for a loan," Damien said, "a relatively small amount. He repaid it. Then he came back, and again. The third time we extended credit, there were conditions attached that were standard for the arrangement, collateral." She felt something cold move through her chest. "What collateral?" Damien was quiet. "What collateral?" she said again, and her voice had gone flat in the way it did when she was constructing containment around something she needed to understand before she could afford to feel it. "You," he said, "not in the terms you're thinking, not—" He stopped, started again. "Your father signed documentation 7 years ago that included a provision. In the event of default above a certain threshold, the organization would have a claim on a decision-making role in the life of his primary dependent." He met her eyes. "He described you to us at the time. Your age, your circumstances. The documentation was structured to function as a guardianship transfer once you came of age." The room was very quiet. "He signed me away," she said, "when I was 17. He signed a document whose full implications I'm not certain he understood." "Don't protect him," she said sharply. Damien did not flinch. "I'm not. I'm telling you the truth about what I can verify, which is that the document exists and that your father signed it. What he understood at the time is something I can't verify." She stood up, not because she had somewhere to go, because sitting felt unbearable. She moved to the window, not the one she'd been told to stay away from, a different one, facing west over the front drive. She put her hand against the glass and felt the cold of it. "You've had this document for 7 years," she said. "Yes." "And you never acted on it?" "No." "Why?" A long pause, the longest she'd heard from him. "Because you were 17, and then you were 19 and 20 and 22, and the situation I didn't—" He stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was careful in the way that things are careful when they're carrying more weight than they're showing. "The document gave me a claim. It did not obligate me to exercise it." She turned from the window. "What changed 3 months ago?" He looked at her directly. "The Serrano Group found the document." The cold moved through her chest again, differently this time. "They found it. Someone inside this organization gave it to them, along with enough context to understand what you represented, what the document meant about your relationship to me, to this organization. They've been," he chose the word carefully, "investing in your vicinity since then. Your father's most recent debt escalation was not organic. He was encouraged." She heard the word encouraged and understood what it contained. They pushed him into debt, she said, to manufacture the situation that would force you to call in the document. To force me to make you visible, Damien said. To confirm that you mattered to this organization in a specific way. Once they confirmed that, they would have leverage. She stood absolutely still. What kind of leverage? He held her gaze. The kind that comes from having access to someone the other side can't afford to lose. The silence stretched between them. She thought about the 3 men in the East Garden last night, confirming location. Not there to hurt her. Not yet. Just confirming she was here. Reporting back. So by marrying me, she said slowly, you took me off the board as a potential hostage. I made you harder to move, he said. Not impossible. Harder. And the person inside your organization who gave them the document. The quality of the pause changed. She was beginning to read his pauses the way you read weather. Not just the presence of them, but the texture. This one was different. This one had heat in it. I have a candidate, he said. Who? I'm not certain enough to say. Damien. He looked at her when she used his name. The first time she had, she realized. Something in his face registered it. His name is Theo Carver, he said. He's been my primary advisor for 6 years. He manages internal communications, scheduling, and has access to the archive where that document is stored. He stopped. He also has a sister who married into the Serrano family 8 months ago, which I did not know until 4 days ago. Elena processed this. You've been sitting across from the leak for 6 years. Possibly. I don't have proof yet. But you believe it. I believe it strongly enough that I moved certain conversations out of rooms he has access to. A pause. Including this one. She looked around the study. He doesn't have access here. No, this room is mine. The surveillance here feeds only to my personal system. She thought about Marcus Hale, standing in the kitchen with his tablet and his coffee and the expression of a man receiving bad information. Does Marcus know about Carver? Damien's eyes sharpened slightly. Why do you ask? Because Marcus gave me a card last night and left me alone, and this morning he offered to walk me to you. The posture changed. Either he got new instructions or he got new information. The sharpening intensified. It was she was starting to understand what interest looked like on his face, not performed, not warm, just the precise attention of someone whose assessment of a variable had just been revised upward. Marcus knows I have a candidate, Damien said. He doesn't know who. I haven't told him because Marcus and Carver have adjacent responsibilities, and if Carver detected that Marcus's behavior had changed, the leak closes, she said. And you lose your chance to identify the full scope of what he's passed. Yes. She sat back down. She picked up the coffee she'd carried from the kitchen and found it had gone cold and drank it anyway because her hands needed something to do. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her. The assessment quality again. The cartographer looking at an uncharted coast. Nothing right now. I need you to move normally through this house. Speak to people naturally. Don't avoid Carver specifically if you encounter him, but don't seek him out. You want me to be observable. I want the observation of you to be unremarkable. She understood. She was a variable in a controlled experiment. Her presence, her behavior, her apparent adjustment to this new life, all of it was data that would flow back through whatever channel Carver was using, and the quality of that data mattered to the operation Damien was running. She didn't love this. She also understood its logic. When do I meet Carver? She said. He'll be at the house this afternoon, staff meeting. You don't have to attend, but your presence would be unremarkable, she said. Yes, I'll be there. The staff meeting took place in a ground floor room that functioned as a situation room of sorts. A long table, screens on one wall, 8 people who were introduced to Elena by name and function in the manner of a team briefing, where a new variable had been introduced and everyone was adjusting for its presence. She sat at Damien's left and kept her hands flat on the table and paid attention to everything. Theo Carver arrived 4 minutes late. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured, without knowing it, something with legible guilt, someone whose betrayal had left a mark on the surface of him. What she found was a man of about 45, trim and compact, with a pleasant face of the forgettable variety and small, quick eyes that moved around a room with the practiced ease of someone who has been assessing rooms for a long time. He wore a jacket over a black shirt. He shook her hand when Damien introduced them and said it was good to finally meet her, and his grip was warm and dry, and his smile reached his eyes in the specific way of someone who has practiced until it reaches his eyes. "Elena," he said, "welcome to the family." And he said it with exactly enough warmth to be genuine and exactly enough distance to be respectful, and nothing in it that she could point to and call wrong. She smiled and said thank you and watched him take his seat 3 chairs down the table. She watched him through the next 90 minutes while Damien ran through operational updates, while Marcus presented a security assessment that carefully omitted the East Garden incident from the previous night, which meant Marcus was either protecting the information or had been instructed to, and either way it meant Carver would be operating without that data point, while the other 6 people at the table spoke and questioned and received information. She watched Carver's eyes. He was very good, but there were 2 moments, 2 in 90 minutes, where his attention moved to a specific place on the wall screen at a specific type of information with a quality of interest that was a fraction too controlled, the way you control interest in something you already know so that you don't look like you already know it. She didn't say anything. She held the observation the way she was learning to hold things, carefully, with both hands, without squeezing. After the meeting, as people were filing out, Carver stopped next to her chair. "First formal meeting," he said. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," she said. "A lot to take in." "It gets smaller," he said. "The first week everything feels enormous. Then you learn the structure and it starts to make sense." He paused. "Damien can be hard to read. If you ever need someone to translate, I've known him a long time." She looked at him. "That's kind of you." "Just practical." He smiled. "We function better when everyone has context." He left. She sat for a moment in the emptying room, her hand still flat on the table. Then she got up and found Damien in the hallway outside and fell into step beside him and waited until they were in the study with the door closed before she spoke. "He offered to be my translator," she said. Damien stopped moving. "Said if I needed someone to help me understand you, he'd been around long enough to interpret." She looked at him. "That's not casual conversation. That's an opening." Damien's jaw shifted. "He's moving faster than I expected." "Because the people who sent the men to the garden last night reported back. They confirmed I'm here and that I'm adjusting, and Carver knows his window is short. Once I'm fully embedded, he loses easy access to information about the internal structure from my perspective." She paused. "He's going to try to develop me as a source." The word develop landed in the room with a weight she felt in her own chest. She was describing herself as a target. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was an accurate one. "If I let him," she said, "how much of what he's planning can we see?" Damien looked at her for a long moment. "It's dangerous." "I know." "You'd be in direct contact with someone who's actively working against this organization. If he suspects you're aware, he won't suspect me," she said. "I'm new. I'm nervous. I'm a woman who married into something she doesn't understand and who just got offered a friendly face." She met his eyes. He'll believe it because it's what he expects. The expression on Damien's face was the one she hadn't been able to name before. She was naming it now. It was the expression of a man encountering something he had prepared a place for without knowing it, the way you might clear space in a room for furniture you hadn't yet seen and then find the dimensions are exactly right. "I need you to understand the risk," he said. "I understand it." "Elena." "I understand it," she said again, with enough weight behind the words that he received them. "I'm not doing it because I don't understand it. I'm doing it because it's the fastest way to know the full shape of what we're dealing with, and I need to know the shape." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "If he asks you for anything specific, any information about operations, schedules, my movements, you tell me immediately, before you respond to him, if possible." "Yes." "And if something feels wrong, I'll tell you immediately." "Yes." She paused. "Same expectation in return. If something about what he tells me clarifies who else is involved, I want to know." "Agreed." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "The document," she said. The one my father signed. I want to see it. A pause. Then, I'll have it for you tonight. She nodded. She opened the door and went back out into the house that was hers now, in the way that prisons and fortresses can both belong to the people who live in them, the way that belonging and confinement are sometimes the same address. And she walked through it with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides and her mind very busy and her face showing none of it. She found Carver at lunch in the informal dining room where several staff members ate when the schedule allowed. She took a plate and sat 2 seats away from him and asked him a question about the logistics wing of the organization, framed as the naive curiosity of a woman trying to understand her new context. He answered carefully and generously, and his small, quick eyes were warm, and she listened and nodded and stored every word. 3 days passed in this rhythm. She let Carver approach her, let the conversations deepen naturally, let him read her as someone searching for footing, which wasn't entirely false. She was searching for footing, just not the kind he thought. On the 4th day, he suggested they take coffee in his office, which was on the 2nd floor on the opposite side of the building from the study. And when she sat in the chair across from his desk, she noticed that the window behind him faced the east garden. The east garden, the wall the 3 men had come over. She filed this. "Can I ask you something direct?" Carver said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. "Sure," she said. "How much do you actually know about what happened with your father's debt?" She looked at him. She calibrated. How much surprise was right? How much wariness? How much of the confused new wife who was still assembling the picture? "I know there was money owed," she said. "Damien has been gradual about explaining specifics." "Gradual," Carver said. He nodded slowly. "That's Damien. He gives people what he thinks they need when he thinks they need it. He doesn't always account for the fact that the person who needs it might have a different timeline." "I've noticed," she said. "Your father," Carver said, and he said it carefully, watching her face, "had a complicated relationship with this organization, longer than the debt would suggest." She let uncertainty show. "What do you mean, longer?" Carver paused with his cup halfway to his mouth. "There's documentation," he said. "Older than the current debt. I've seen it. It involves you, Elena. It involves choices your father made that Damien has not been fully transparent about." Her chest was tight. She kept her breathing even. "What kind of choices?" He set the cup down, leaned forward slightly. "I want you to understand that I'm telling you this because you deserve the truth, not because it serves anyone's agenda. You walked into this house without the full picture, and that's not fair to you." She looked at him and thought about the word fair coming out of the mouth of the man who had handed a document detailing her life to the people trying to use her as a weapon. "Tell me," she said. He was halfway through the opening of what would have been a carefully constructed partial truth. Enough real information to establish credibility. The real distortions would come later. She could see the architecture of it. When the door of his office opened, it was Marcus. His face was the face of a man delivering something he'd been carrying all morning and was relieved to put down. "Mr. Carver," he said, "Mr. Vescari needs you in the Situation Room, now." Carver looked at Marcus, then at Elena. Something moved through his expression. So brief she almost missed it, but she was watching for it. She had been watching for the moment when his control had to work harder than usual. It passed in under a second. He was already standing, already composing the pleasant professional face. "Of course," he said. He looked at Elena. "We'll finish this conversation." "I'll be here," she said. He left with Marcus. She sat alone in his office for a moment and looked at the window facing the east garden and thought about what he'd been about to tell her, and what the truth underneath it would have been, and how far he'd gotten in 6 years of being trusted with everything. Then she looked at his desk. The computer screen was dark. He had closed it before she came in. She had noticed that, the way you notice a door that's been carefully shut. But there was a leather portfolio to the left of the monitor, closed but not latched, and the corner of a document was visible at the edge of it, a 1/4 inch of white paper with a printed header. She could see if she leaned slightly. She did not lean slightly. She sat perfectly still and looked at the corner of the document and thought about what Damien would say and what he had said. and the word immediately, and she understood that the most important thing she could do right now was stand up, leave this office, and find him. She stood up. She walked down the hallway toward the study, moving at the pace of someone going somewhere she belongs, which is both slower than hurrying and faster than wandering. She passed 2 staff members, nodded at both, continued. She was 4 steps from the study door when she heard the voice. Not from inside the study. From the stairwell to her left. A half-open door, a voice coming through it from below. Carver's voice. She had thought he'd gone to the situation room on the ground floor, but the stairwell accessed a secondary exit, and his voice was low and rapid, and he was speaking to someone she couldn't see, and he was saying, she stepped toward the stairwell door without thinking, which was the wrong thing to do, and she knew it as she did it. But she did it because the words she'd caught were her name and the word tonight, and the word has to be tonight, and she needed to understand why. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door and listened. Doesn't matter, Carver was saying. Vescari moved the timeline. He knows. He's known for at least 72 hours, maybe more, which means the window closes the moment he decides he has enough to act. It has to be tonight. A pause. Listening. No, she's not the target, she's the mechanism. Move her and everything else follows. He can't function if she's, a pause, relocated. You understand the difference. Silence. The other voice was not audible. Midnight, Carver said. East entrance. The camera rotation is 23 seconds. You know the window. She pressed her back against the wall and heard the stairwell door pull shut from the inside and heard his footsteps recede down the stairs and the sound of a lower door opening and closing and then silence. She stood in the hallway with her back to the wall and the blood moving very fast through her and thought about the word relocated and thought about midnight and thought about 23 seconds and felt, for the first time since she had walked into that parking structure 2 weeks ago, genuinely afraid in a way that was not useful or generative, but simply animal and immediate. Then she straightened. She pushed open the study door. Damien was at the desk. He looked up, and whatever he saw on her face made him very still. Tonight, she said. Midnight. East entrance. Her voice was steady, which cost her something she couldn't quantify. He's moving me. He said relocate. He said you know, and your timeline is closing, so his has to close first. Damien was on his feet before she finished the sentence. How do you know this? He said, not doubting her, calculating the source. Stairwell off the second floor hall. He didn't know I was there. Did he see you? No. He moved to the desk and his hands were on the keyboard and the monitors came up and she could see from where she stood that he was pulling something, camera feeds, and his face in the monitor light was controlled in the way that things are controlled when the thing they've been waiting for has arrived and there's no longer any use for patience. Elena, he said, not looking up from the screens. Yes. I need you to go back to your rooms, lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me or Marcus, and Marcus will knock 4 times. He paused. Not 3, not 5. 4. She thought about the East Garden, and the camera rotation, and the 23-second window and midnight still hours away. What are you going to do? She said. He looked up from the screens then. His eyes found hers and held them with an intensity that was not dramatic, but was completely and utterly serious. I'm going to end this, he said. Tonight. She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she turned and walked back through the door and up the stairs to her rooms and locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the early afternoon light and thought about the word relocated and the word mechanism and the word tonight, and understood with complete and terrible clarity that whatever she had thought she was walking into when she stood in that parking structure with her hands in her coat pockets and her car keys cutting into her palm, whatever she had imagined this was, she had been wrong about its scale entirely. The door to her life before this house had not simply closed behind her. It had been locked from the outside, the key removed, and someone she had not yet identified was standing on the other side of it, deciding what came next. She sat on the edge of the bed and counted the minutes. Not metaphorically. Actually counted them, measuring the afternoon light moving across the floor by increments, tracking the shift from pale yellow to the flat gray of early evening, listening to the house below her change its rhythm the way a body changes its breathing when it moves from rest to readiness. She had locked the door as instructed. She had not turned on any lights. She sat in the gathering dark and thought about midnight and the east entrance in 23 seconds and the specific, functional terror of being described as a mechanism. Not a person. A mechanism. She thought about that word for a long time. At some point, Petra knocked and left a tray outside the door without being asked. She heard the footsteps, the soft placement of something on the floor, the footsteps receding. She didn't open the door to get it. She wasn't hungry, and more than that, she didn't want to open the door for any reason that wasn't 4 knocks. Because the moment you started making exceptions to the rule was the moment the rule stopped protecting you. The light died completely by 7. The house below her was quieter than it had been, which was not the same as quiet. She could feel activity in it the way you feel weather in your joints, a pressure change, a quality of tension in the air that communicated organized movement without revealing its specifics. Doors opened and closed at measured intervals. Voices came and went at the lower register of purposeful communication. At one point she heard something that might have been raised voices 2 floors below, and then nothing, the nothing that follows a decision being made. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed at 8:15 when the knock came. 4 times. Exactly. She crossed the room and unlocked the door. Marcus Hale stood in the hallway, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for several hours and has not yet been given permission to set it down. "Mr. Vescari asks that you come downstairs," he said. "Carver?" "Contained," Marcus said. The word was a complete sentence. She understood it as such. She followed him down. The situation room on the ground floor had been reconfigured since the afternoon meeting. Chairs pushed back, the long table now functioning as a surface for equipment rather than discussion. 2 men she didn't recognize positioned near the door, with the alert stillness of people on a specific assignment. Damien was standing at the far end of the room with his back partially to her, speaking in a low voice to a man she recognized as one of the senior staff from the afternoon briefing. He turned when she entered. His face told her something had gone differently than planned. Not wrong, exactly. Damien's face did not do wrong. It didn't collapse or fragment under pressure, but differently. The controlled burn she'd seen in his eyes when she'd told him about midnight had been replaced with something steadier and colder, the kind of cold that comes after a fire rather than before one. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Carver is in the East Wing," he said. "He's not going anywhere. But there's something you need to know before we proceed, and I need you to hear it from me rather than from what he's going to say when we question him, because the order in which you receive information matters, and I'm not willing to let him control that sequence." She looked at him steadily. "Say it." Damien moved to the chair across from her and sat. This was unusual. He had a pattern of standing through difficult conversations. She'd already noticed it. The way standing gave him the option of movement, and the fact that he was sitting now communicated that what he was about to say required him to be on her level for it. "The document your father signed," he said, 7 years ago. "The collateral provision." "Yes. I told you the truth about what it contained, a guardianship transfer, a claim on your future under specific conditions." He paused. "I did not tell you who drafted it." She felt the cold begin in her chest. "Who drafted it?" "Theo Carver," he said. "He was with this organization already at that point. He had been for 2 years. I brought him in as a financial architect, someone to structure the credit arrangements, make them legally defensible from a certain angle. The collateral provision was his language, his design. She processed this. "You didn't write it." "I reviewed it and approved it," he said, and the weight in those words was the weight of a man not flinching from his own accountability. "That's not the same as writing it, but it's not nothing. I want to be clear about that." "But Carver designed the specific provision, the one that put me in it." "Yes." "Why?" she said. 7 years ago, he had no reason to. She stopped. The arithmetic was moving in her head, the variables rearranging, the equation shifting toward a resolution she hadn't seen coming. Unless he already had a relationship with the Serrano group 7 years ago. Damien's jaw moved. "That's what I believe." "Yes." So the provision wasn't designed to protect this organization's interests. It was designed as a long-term instrument. She heard her own voice from a slight distance, the way you hear yourself speak when the thinking is happening faster than the speaking. Something that could be used eventually, when the conditions were right. A sleeper clause, Damien said, buried in standard-looking documentation. I had no reason to read it as anything other than what it appeared to be at the time. She sat with this. Outside the window, the grounds were lit by the security system, the east garden visible from this angle as a pale rectangle of light against the dark. She thought about Carver drafting language about her life when she was 17 years old and sitting in her high school cafeteria with no knowledge that a man in a room somewhere was writing her future into a contract as a contingency. There's more, Damien said. She looked at him. Carver didn't find out about the Serrano connection through his sister's marriage, he said. We found his communications in the past 2 hours. The sister's marriage was cover. He's been a Serrano asset since before he joined this organization. He was placed here. The room was very still. He was sent to you, she said, 8 years ago, before your father ever walked through any door associated with this organization. A pause. Your father was not a random contact. He was identified by Carver as a target, a man with the right combination of desperation, ego, and proximity to someone the Serrano group had already flagged as a potential leverage point. She felt the floor of everything shift. They flagged me, she said slowly, before my father was even in debt to you, before any of this. They identified me as leverage against you, years before you and I had ever been in the same room. Yes, Damien said. Why, she said. Why me specifically? I'm nobody. I was nobody. I worked at a copy center. I paid my father's bills. She stopped. Something in his expression had changed. Something had arrived in it that she hadn't seen before. Not the reassessment, not the cold focus. Something else. Something that had weight behind it of a different kind. Damien. He held her gaze. Your mother, he said. The word landed in his room like something physical. Elena had not heard anyone in this house speak about her mother. She had not spoken about her mother. Margaret Ashcroft had been dead for 9 years, a cardiac event at 44, quick and without warning in the kitchen of the Crest Avenue apartment while Elena was at school. And the absence of her had been a thing Elena carried the way you carry a structural injury, always present, worked around, not discussed with people who didn't already know. What about my mother? She said, and her voice had gone to a place she didn't recognize, somewhere very controlled and very dangerous. Her name before she married your father was Margaret Voss, Damien said. She worked for 12 years as a forensic accountant, private sector, corporate clients primarily. In the last 3 years of her career, she was retained by a firm to conduct an internal audit that expanded beyond its original scope. He paused. She found something. A financial architecture, a network of accounts, shell companies, transfer mechanisms that connected organized crime operations across 6 syndicates in this city, including the Serrano Group's predecessor organization, through a single point of control. Elena was not breathing. She documented it, Damien said, completely, forensically. The kind of documentation that could have dismantled every major criminal financial operation in this city simultaneously. He held her gaze without flinching. She came to me with it, not to the authorities, to me. Because the point of control she'd identified had connections inside the city's legal enforcement structure, and she didn't know how far those connections went. She came to you, Elena said. Each word was separate, distinct. She trusted me to hold it, to protect the documentation until she could identify a safe route to use it. A pause. She died 6 weeks later. The kitchen of the Crest Avenue apartment, a cardiac event at 44, quick and without warning. They killed her, Elena said. I believe so. I couldn't prove it then. I still can't prove it in any way that would survive legal scrutiny. His voice was level, but the levelness was load-bearing. The documentation she gave me? I've held it for 9 years, waiting for the same thing she was waiting for, a safe route, a moment when the network's exposure could be complete rather than partial, because partial exposure would only eliminate some of them and the rest would rebuild. Elena stood up. She didn't do it consciously. Her body made the decision before her mind completed the thought, standing being the only available response to what was happening in her chest, which was not grief exactly. It was something older and larger than grief. It was the specific devastation of understanding that a thing you thought was random, an ordinary cardiac event, a woman falling in her kitchen at 44, was not random at all, had never been random, had been designed. "She came to you," she said again, "and then she died. And you held her documentation for 9 years and said nothing." "I said nothing because speaking would have gotten you killed," Damien said. "You were 15 when she died. You were a child with a gambling addict for a father and no protection, and the people who had killed your mother were still operational and watching for any indication that the documentation existed outside their reach." His voice did not rise, did not soften. It stayed at exactly the same level, which was somehow harder to receive than either alternative. "I made a promise to your mother 6 weeks before she died. I told her I would protect her daughter. I told her that whatever it cost, whatever form that protection had to take, I would keep you outside their reach until I could end this completely." The room was absolutely silent. Elena stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him across the space between them and thought about 9 years. 9 years of this man in this house, holding her mother's documentation, watching her from whatever distance was required, waiting. The ring with the garnet stone. The way he'd looked at it before he gave it to her. The way you look at something with more history than its size would suggest. The charity event photograph 6 years ago, a man standing in the back of a group, shot not positioned to be identified. The document her father had signed when she was 17. Carver's language. Carver, who had been placed here to find the documentation, to locate whatever Margaret Voss had given Damien Vescari before she died. And when Carver couldn't find it, when 9 years of access hadn't turned it up, the Serrano group had shifted strategy. Stop looking for the documentation. Find the daughter instead. Because the documentation and the daughter might be connected in ways that hadn't yet been understood. "They think I know where it is," she said. "They think you might be the key to accessing it," Damien said. "Your mother left certain things indexed in a way that only makes complete sense with information she would have given specifically to you. Things she may have told you before she died without you understanding their significance." Elena thought about her mother, Margaret Ashcroft, née Voss, forensic accountant, 44 years old, dead in a kitchen. Elena thought about the things her mother had said in the last weeks of her life. Ordinary things, kitchen table things, the things a mother says to a teenage daughter that get stored in memory as texture rather than content because you don't know yet that you're running out of time. She thought about a specific afternoon, 2 months before the kitchen, her mother sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a notebook, and Elena coming in from school and her mother looking up and saying, out of nowhere, entirely without context, "There are numbers that matter, Ellie. Not the ones people show you, the ones underneath." Elena had thought she was talking about mathematics. She'd been taking calculus that semester. The cold in her chest moved into her hands. "She told me something," Elena said. "Before she died. I thought she was talking about school." Damien was very still. "She said there are numbers that matter, not the ones people show you, the ones underneath." She looked at him. "That's not a general statement. That's a specific instruction." "Yes," he said, and the word carried the accumulated weight of 9 years of waiting for exactly this. The door of the Situation Room opened. It was one of the men from near the entrance, and his face had the specific quality of someone interrupting something because the alternative is worse. "Sir," he said. "Carver. He's asking to speak. He says he has information about tonight that changes the operational picture, and he'll only give it directly." Damien looked at the man, then at Elena. "Bring him," he said. They brought Theo Carver into the Situation Room 3 minutes later. His wrists were zip-tied in front of him, which was the only visible sign of his current situation. His face was composed. His clothing was barely disturbed. He had the appearance of a man who had spent the past several hours preparing for exactly this conversation, rather than experiencing it as a crisis. He looked at Elena when he entered, not at Damien, at Elena. "Good," he said. "She should hear this." Sit down and say what you came to say, Damien said. Carver sat. He looked at his bound wrists with mild interest, as though they were someone else's problem, and then looked up. The midnight operation is a decoy, he said. The room absorbed this. The east entrance, the camera rotation, the 23-second window. That conversation was designed to be overheard. He held Elena's gaze. I knew you were in the hallway. I've known your position in this house since approximately 4 hours after you arrived, because I have a passive monitor on the third-floor corridor that Viscari's sweep didn't identify. He paused. I needed you to hear enough to bring it to him immediately. I needed tonight's security posture to concentrate on the east entrance. Elena felt the cold relocate, moving from her chest to somewhere more central, somewhere structural. While this house watches the east entrance at midnight, Carver continued, a separate team enters through the utility access on the north perimeter. Their objective is not you. He looked at Damien. Their objective is the archive. Damien said nothing. His face said nothing. But something in the stillness of him changed quality, shifted from controlled to something that was controlling something larger than before. They know the documentation exists, Carver said. They've known for 3 years. What they didn't know until recently was its storage location. 4 days ago, they identified it. Or they believe they did. He paused again with the deliberate timing of a man who has arranged this speech in advance and is committed to its structure. They're wrong about the location, but they'll destroy what they find regardless, and the collateral damage to your infrastructure will be significant. Why are you telling us this? Elena said. Carver looked at her. Because the operation changes tonight regardless of what I do or don't say. The people I work for have decided that the documentation is more dangerous than the alliance with me is valuable. I've been made expendable. He said it without self-pity, which was the most unsettling version of the statement. I'm telling you this because I want something in exchange. You're not in a position to want things, Damien said. I'm in the only position where wanting things makes sense, Carver said, because what I know and what I'm willing to say right now is the only currency I have left. He looked between them. I know the name of the person inside the city's legal enforcement structure that your mother identified, Elena. The connection she found. The reason she couldn't go to the authorities. The silence was absolute. I know who killed her, Carver said. Not the mechanism. Not who physically, but who gave the instruction. Who decided that Margaret Voss needed to stop being a problem. He held Elena's gaze with the steadiness of someone who understood exactly what he was holding. That name is worth something. Tell me what you're willing to offer, and I'll tell you whether it's enough. Elena looked at this man who had sat across from her at lunch and offered to be her translator, who had drafted the language that wrote her into a contract at 17, who had been sent here 8 years ago to find her mother's work and destroy it. And she felt something clarify inside her that was not quite rage and not quite grief and was not anything she had a clean word for, but was very precise and very cold and very permanent. There's nothing I'm willing to offer you, she said. Carver looked at her. Then the name dies with the operation tonight, and whoever killed your mother continues to operate inside a system that can protect them indefinitely. Elena, Damien said. The word was a question. She held Carver's gaze. Get me into that archive, she said, to Damien, not to Carver. Right now, before midnight, before whatever team they're sending reaches the north perimeter. She paused. My mother told me about the numbers underneath. I think I know what she meant. I think the access to the complete documentation isn't in the archive storage itself. I think it's indexed. And I think the index key is something she put inside me without me knowing it. Damien was already on his feet. If I'm right, Elena said, still looking at Carver, we won't need what he's selling. Something moved through Carver's expression. The first thing that had moved through it involuntarily. Not fear exactly. The thing adjacent to fear that arrives when a plan designed around a specific assumption encounters evidence that the assumption was wrong. She turned away from him and followed Damien toward the door and didn't look back. The archive was 2 levels below the ground floor, accessed through a corridor she hadn't been in before. The kind of space that communicated serious purpose, climate-controlled, low light, the smell of a room that takes the preservation of paper seriously. The walls were shelving. The shelving held files going back, she estimated, 15 or 20 years. The accumulated documentation of an organization that understood its own history as both asset and liability. Damien led her to a specific section at the north end. He pulled a file and placed it on the reading table at the center of the room. She recognized her mother's handwriting on the interior label before she registered the file's reference number. She stood over the file and put her hands flat on the table. The gesture she'd unconsciously taken from him, she realized. The hands-flat posture, the "I'm not reaching for anything" stance. And she looked at the indexed contents and thought about what her mother had said. Not the ones people show you, the ones underneath. She reached into the file and lifted the first visible layer of documentation. Beneath it was a second layer in a different organizational structure. She looked at the reference numbers on the second layer and felt something in her memory respond. Not a specific recollection, more like a resonance, a frequency matching a frequency, the way a tuning fork responds to its own note. "She used to quiz me," Elena said quietly, to herself as much as to him. "When I was young, before the kitchen, before any of this. She'd read me number sequences and asked me to repeat them back. I thought it was a memory game." She looked at the reference numbers on the second layer. It wasn't a game. She closed her eyes. She let the numbers in front of her rest against the interior of her memory, like a key resting against a lock. And somewhere in the place where her mother had stored the things that mattered, something turned. She opened her eyes and looked at Damien. "I know where the complete index is," she said. She didn't store it here. She stored it in the only place she knew they could never search. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. "She stored it in me. The number sequence she taught me. They're not random. They're a filing system. Every sequence corresponds to a location in this archive that the visible organization of the files doesn't reveal." Damien looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the outermost edge of something he didn't have a name for either. "How long will it take you to reconstruct it?" he said. She looked at the files. She looked at the clock on the archive wall. It was 9:47. Midnight was 2 hours and 13 minutes away, and a team was already moving toward the north perimeter with instructions to destroy what they found. And a man upstairs was sitting with zip-tied wrists and the name of the person who had decided her mother needed to stop being a problem. And she was standing in a basement with her dead mother's handwriting on a file label and the sound of her own heartbeat very loud in her ears. "Not long enough," she said. "Not before midnight." Damien's phone vibrated. He looked at it. His face did the thing it did when incoming information required immediate physical response, the controlled acceleration, everything sharpening at once. He looked up at her. "The north perimeter," he said. "They're not waiting for midnight." She looked at the files. She looked at the clock. She looked at him. "They moved the timeline," she said. "They moved the timeline," he confirmed. And then, from somewhere above them, through 2 floors of stone and concrete and the careful architecture of a house that had survived things it wasn't going to explain, she heard the sound of breaking glass, and then voices, and then something that was not voices at all, but was louder and more final. And the overhead light in the archive flickered once and held, and Damien's hand closed around her arm with a grip that was not gentle, but was absolutely sure. And he said close to her ear, in the voice of a man who has already made every calculation available and arrived at the only remaining option. "We go now." She grabbed the file with her mother's handwriting on the label and held it against her chest with both arms, and let him pull her toward the corridor, and the sound from above them was getting louder, and somewhere in the house that had been hers for less than 2 weeks, a door was coming off its hinges, and the woman who had walked into a parking structure believing she was saving her father was running through a basement corridor with her dead mother's secrets pressed against her heart, understanding with the totality of someone who has finally received all the available information that she had never been the person being rescued in this story. She had always been the person they were trying to bury. The corridor was 40 feet long and felt like 400. Damien moved ahead of her, not running. Running was noise. Running was panic. Running was the decision to abandon control of your environment in exchange for speed. But covering ground with the compressed efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this, for the moment when a building you thought was yours became a building that wasn't. She matched his pace and kept the file pressed against her chest with both forearms, and focused on the back of his shoulder because focusing on one fixed point was the only way to keep the part of her brain that wanted to process the sounds from above from taking over the part that needed to function. The sounds were getting worse. Not louder, exactly. The stone and concrete dampened volume effectively, but more complex, which was in some ways worse than louder. Multiple sources. Movement on more than one floor. The specific percussion of things being opened that were not designed to be opened. Damien stopped at a junction in the corridor, left or right. He was still for 2 full seconds. She could see him running a calculation she didn't have the map for. And then he went left, and she went left behind him, and 20 feet further the corridor ended at a steel door with a keypad, and he put in a code and the door opened into a stairwell that smelled like stone and cold air and absence. Up, he said. The north perimeter. They came through the north. We go east. There's a vehicle staged at the east access point. He held the door. Move. She moved. The stairwell went up 3 flights. She counted them without meaning to, her hand trailing the wall for orientation in the near dark. The file tucked under one arm now because she needed the other for balance. Her breathing was controlled but effortful. The kind of breathing you do when your body wants to breathe faster and your mind is overriding it. Because faster breathing is louder breathing, and louder breathing is information given to people you haven't yet located. Her heart was doing something large and rhythmic against her ribs. She noticed it the way you notice weather. It was happening. It was significant. She didn't have time to address it. At the top of the 3rd flight, Damien pushed open a door and the night air hit her like a correction. They were on the east side of the property, outside the main structure, the garden to their left, and the perimeter wall 40 feet ahead. There was a vehicle, a dark SUV, engine running, which meant someone had started it recently, which meant someone had anticipated this exit, which meant Damien had contingency layers she hadn't been briefed on and was grateful for. A man she recognized from the Situation Room was behind the wheel. Another was at the rear of the vehicle, watching the approach corridor with the attention of someone doing a specific job. Get in, Damien said. She got in. He got in beside her. The vehicle was moving before the door fully closed. Marcus, she said. I know, he said. He had his phone in his hand. He's in the north wing. He knows the extraction route. Carver is no longer in the Situation Room, the man in the front passenger seat said without turning around, with the flat tone of someone delivering a factual update. He was moved to the East holding space at 2200 hours. We're confirming his current status. She looked at Damien. He met her eyes briefly. Confirming current status meant they didn't know where Carver was. Confirming current status, in a night that had just demonstrated it was running a different schedule than anyone had planned, meant Carver might be anywhere. She looked at the file in her arms. Where are we going? She said. Secondary location, Damien said. Off property. We have 6 minutes before this route becomes a question I don't want to answer. The vehicle moved through the east gate. The gate opened as they approached, someone operating it remotely, another contingency layer, and onto the road, and the estate disappeared behind them, and she looked back through the rear window and saw light in the upper windows of the manor that was not the lighting she had come to associate with that house. A harsher, more scattered light, the light of rooms being gone through rather than occupied, and she turned back around and looked at the road ahead and held the file tighter. The secondary location was a building in the Fenwick district, 20 minutes from the estate by the route they took, which was not a direct route. It occupied the upper 2 floors of what appeared from the street to be a commercial property, import business on the ground floor, the kind that operates regular hours and asks no questions about the floors above it. They entered through a side door and climbed stairs and came out into a space that had the assembled quality of a room made ready rather than a room naturally occupied. Furniture positioned for function, equipment already running, 2 people already present who stood when Damien entered and relaxed slightly when they saw Elena. She put the file on the nearest table. I need 45 minutes, she said. Damien was already at the equipment station. You have 30. I need 45. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, the compressed version of an argument he decided not to make. 35. 35, she said. She opened the file. The number sequences her mother had taught her were not 20 years old in her memory. They were older than that, laid down in the period of early childhood, when things get stored at a depth that doesn't erode the way surface memory does. The same depth where you store the sound of a specific voice, the weight of a specific hand, the temperature of a specific kitchen on a specific afternoon. She had carried these sequences for 20 years without knowing what they were. The way you carry the words of a language you were taught before you understood language, available at a register below conscious recall. She sat at the table and opened the file and looked at the index structure her mother had built and let the sequences come up from wherever they lived. They came, not all at once. In order, the order they'd been taught, the order that was itself part of the system, because the sequence of retrieval was as significant as the content. She worked through the file with a pen she'd taken from the equipment table, annotating, cross-referencing, building the map her mother had built, and then distributed between a basement archive and her daughter's memory so that neither half was usable without the other. At the 12-minute mark, Damien's phone rang. He answered, listened for approximately 15 seconds, and said 2 words she couldn't hear from across the room. His face, when he lowered the phone, was the face of someone receiving information that changes the shape of the current situation. "Marcus is out," he said. "He's en route here." She didn't look up from the file. "And Carver?" A pause. "Carver is with him." She looked up. "Not voluntarily," Damien said. "Marcus found him at the north perimeter. He was attempting to leave with something from the archive." "What something?" "We don't know yet. Marcus has it." She looked back down at the file. Her pen moved. The map was building itself in the space between what was written and what she remembered, the intersection of her mother's documentation and her mother's teaching, and she understood as she worked that this was what Margaret Voss had done. Not hidden the information in one place where it could be found and destroyed, but split it between the permanent and the biological, between paper and a child, because paper can be burned, but a child carries things forward, whether she knows it or not. At the 22-minute mark, Marcus Hale arrived. He was not uninjured. There was a cut above his left ear that had bled down the side of his face and dried there, and his jacket was torn at the right shoulder, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing something in their side that they're not drawing attention to. He had Carver with him, Carver whose wrists were now bound with something more substantial than zip ties, whose face had finally lost the professional pleasantness and was showing something rawer underneath, the expression of a man whose plan has failed in ways he didn't account for and who is now doing rapid revision. And Marcus was carrying a leather portfolio, the leather portfolio from Carver's desk, the one she'd seen in the afternoon with the corner of a document visible at its edge, the one she hadn't leaned forward to look at because she'd understood in that moment that the most important thing was to leave and find Damien. Marcus put the portfolio on the table. He had it inside his jacket, Marcus said, north wall. He wasn't leaving with the documentation from the archive. He was leaving with this. Damien opened the portfolio. Elena stood up from her chair and crossed the room and looked at what was inside it. And what was inside it was a single document of approximately 12 pages, printed, not handwritten, with a header she could read from 2 feet away. The header contained a name she recognized. Not from this house, not from anything connected to Damien or this organization or the Serrano Group or any of the architecture of the past 3 weeks. A name she recognized from the news, from the public record, from the kind of visibility that comes with a specific kind of institutional power. A name that appeared on buildings and on ballots and in the newspaper in connection with the administration of the city's legal and financial infrastructure. Senator Aldrich Vane. She looked at the document. She looked at Carver. "He's the point of control," she said, "the one my mother found, the connection between the criminal financial network and the legal enforcement structure." She looked at the document, not reading it fully yet, just taking in its shape, its scope. "This is documentation of his involvement." "It's more than that," Damien said, his voice at a register she hadn't heard before. Something lower and more controlled than usual. The voice of someone looking at something they've been trying to reach for 9 years and have just put their hands on. It's the complete financial architecture. Accounts, transfers, shell company chains. Everything Margaret documented is here, but this version has been updated. Someone has been maintaining this file. He looked at Carver. Carver said nothing. "You've been maintaining it," Damien said. It was not a question. Carver's jaw moved. "Vane has been my operational controller for 6 years. Not the Serrano Group. Vane. The Serrano Group works for Vane. Everything you've been fighting, everything that's been coming at this organization for 3 years, it comes from him. He needed the documentation destroyed because Margaret Voss built something comprehensive enough to bring down not just the criminal network, but his entire infrastructure. His political position, his financial holdings, everything." Carver paused. "I've been updating the file because I needed insurance. Against him, because men like Vane don't retire their assets. They eliminate them when the asset becomes a liability." "So you were planning to run," Damien said. "I was planning to survive," Carver said, and the distinction in his voice was real, was the first genuinely unperformed thing she'd heard from him. "There's a difference." Elena looked at the file on the table behind her. Her mother's file, the archive documentation, the map she'd spent 30 minutes reconstructing. She looked at the portfolio in front of her. She thought about Senator Aldrich Vane, and about a kitchen on Crest Avenue 9 years ago, and about a woman who had found something comprehensive enough to bring down an entire infrastructure and had not survived the discovery. She thought about what Carver had said upstairs in the Situation Room. "I know who gave the instruction, who decided that Margaret Voss needed to stop being a problem." "Vane," she said aloud. Carver looked at her. "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Damien's phone rang again, and he answered it, and listened for 4 seconds, and his face did the thing that meant the situation outside had changed, and he said, "How many?" and listened again and said, "Hold the south approach," and lowered the phone. "Vane knows where we are," he said. Elena felt it move through the room. The collective adjustment of everyone present to a new set of coordinates, the reorientation that happens when the perimeter you thought you had collapses and you discover the actual perimeter is considerably closer than estimated. "How?" she said. Damien looked at Carver. Carver looked back at him with something that was almost an apology. "The portfolio has a tracker," he said. "I didn't remove it. I needed them to follow it here because I needed this meeting to happen in front of witnesses, people who could confirm what's in that document." He looked at the portfolio and then at Elena. "I needed Vane to send people here tonight. I needed you to understand that the threat is not the Serrano Group and has never been the Serrano Group. It's him. And I needed there to be no ambiguity about the fact that he's willing to come here and take what that document represents by force." He paused. "I told you I was managing my own survival. This is how I'm doing it." Damien crossed the room in 5 steps, and his hand was at the front of Carver's jacket before Carver could complete whatever adjustment he was making to his expression, and his face was 6 inches from Carver's face, and the temperature of the room dropped by several degrees. "You brought them here," Damien said. Each word had the weight and pace of something being placed down very carefully on an unstable surface. "To this location, with her in it." Carver did not look away. "To this location, with the documentation in it?" "Yes. Because the documentation being here and Vane coming for it in force is the only scenario where what's in those files becomes undeniable. You can't suppress a senator's involvement in organized crime with paper alone. You need the senator to demonstrate it with his own behavior." His voice was steady. "He's coming here tonight to destroy evidence. That's a prosecutable act. I've had a recorder running since Marcus brought me through that door." The silence had a different quality now. Elena turned and looked at the south-facing window. The street below was lit by ordinary streetlights and appeared ordinary, and she understood that appearance and reality were in the process of diverging significantly. "How long?" she said. "Minutes," Damien said. He released Carver and turned, and the operational part of him, the part that functioned at full capacity regardless of what the rest of him was processing, was already running calculations. He looked at the 2 men who had been in the room when they arrived. "North exit, now. Take the archive documentation." He looked at Marcus. "Can you move?" Marcus looked at him with the expression of a man for whom that question has only one answer. "Yes." "East window, fire escape, alley access. Take Carver." He looked at Elena. She was already picking up the portfolio. No, he said. Leave it. She looked at him. It's evidence. It's a target. They're coming for that specific document, and if we leave it, they destroy it and everything in it, and Vane walks away. She held the portfolio. I'm not leaving it. He looked at her for a moment. The look she had come to understand was the look of a man updating his assessment in real time, the cartographer encountering new coastline. And then he said, Stay behind me. Move when I move. Stop when I stop. Do you understand? Yes, she said. They went out through the north exit, down a stairwell she hadn't come up, into an alley that ran parallel to the building's east face. Cold air, wet pavement, the smell of a city at night conducting its ordinary business 30 feet from something that was not ordinary at all. Marcus was moving with Carver 6 feet ahead. The two staff members were behind with the archive documentation in a bag that looked unremarkable because unremarkable was the point. They were 20 feet from the alley's end when the south end of the alley filled with light. Headlights. Two vehicles stopped sideways, a configuration that was unmistakably a block rather than a parking situation, and silhouettes between the vehicles and Elena's group that were moving forward at a pace that communicated professional purpose. Damien stopped. She stopped behind him. He assessed the south, then the north end of the alley, which was still open, then the fire escape on the building to their left, which accessed a roof line she couldn't see from the alley floor. The documentation, he said very quietly to the staff behind her. Roof access. North. Movement behind her. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the silhouettes at the south end of the alley and on Damien's shoulder and on the portfolio in her hands. You, he said to her with the same quietness. Fire escape. Go up. Don't stop until you reach the roof. There will be someone at the north rooftop access who knows you're coming. She looked at the fire escape. She looked at the silhouettes. She looked at him. And you, she said. I'm going to have a conversation, he said. That's not a plan. It's the only plan available right now. He looked at her with a directness that had no room in it for softening. The documentation has to move. You're the only person who can fully reconstruct it if something happens to the physical copies. You understand that, which means you are the thing that cannot be in this alley when those people reach us. She heard this. She understood its logic. She hated its logic with a specific and useless completeness. If something happens to you, she said. Go, he said. She looked at him for one more second. His face in the alley light was the face of a man who has calculated the cost and paid it forward, who is standing in a corridor so that someone else can reach the door at the end. She had seen that face before in a different form. She had seen it in the archive, in her mother's handwriting on a file label, in the structure of documentation built by a woman who understood she was running out of time and made sure the important things would outlast her. She turned and went up the fire escape. The iron was cold and slightly wet, and her hands gripped it with the mechanical surety of a body that has been told what it needs to do and is doing it. Below her, she heard Damien's voice, not words, just tone, the flat authoritative tone of someone initiating a conversation they intend to control. She climbed and did not look down. First landing, second landing. The portfolio was under her arm and the cold of the night was on her face, and her lungs were working at full capacity now. The override lifted, her body finally allowed to breathe at the rate it needed. Third landing, the roof. She came over the edge and a hand reached for her. One of the staff members, already there, the archive bag over his shoulder, his face tight with the specific strain of someone who has been through the past 4 hours and is still functioning on the far side of it. She got her feet under her on the rooftop and turned and looked out over the edge. The alley below was lit by the headlights from the south. She could see Damien standing at the midpoint, his hands at his sides, his posture, the posture of a man who is elected to occupy a specific piece of ground and has no intention of vacating it. She could see the silhouettes from the south now close enough to be figures rather than shapes. 4 of them, and behind them, getting out of the second vehicle with the deliberate care of a man who does not hurry because he has never had to, a 5th figure. The 5th figure was not one of the Serrano Group's operational people. She couldn't see the face from the rooftop, but she could see the quality of the posture, the way the other 4 figures oriented toward the 5th, the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. She could see the suit, which was the suit of a man who has spent decades calibrating his appearance to communicate a specific and precise level of authority. Senator Aldrich Vane was in the alley below her. He had come himself. She gripped the portfolio against her chest and looked down at Damien standing between her and the man who had ordered her mother's death. And she thought about what Carver had said. You can't suppress a senator's involvement in organized crime with paper alone. You need the senator to demonstrate it with his own behavior. And she thought about the recorder Carver claimed he'd been running since Marcus brought him through the door. She thought about her mother, and about numbers underneath, and about everything that gets buried and everything that refuses to stay buried. And she reached into the portfolio and looked at the 12 pages of documentation that Senator Aldrich Vane had sent people to this alley to destroy. And she understood with the cold and total clarity of someone who has finally received the last piece of a picture that has been assembling for her entire adult life. That destroying these pages was not the only option available. That there was another option, one that required her to make a decision that could not be unmade, that would change the shape of everything that came after it. And she looked at the staff member beside her, who had a phone in his jacket pocket, and she said, "Give me that." He looked at her. He looked at the phone. He looked at the alley below. He gave her the phone. She looked at what was in her hands. The phone, the portfolio. 12 pages of her mother's work maintained and expanded by a man who had ultimately understood its value better than the people who'd sent him to destroy it. And she thought about every version of the next 10 minutes, and what each version cost, and what each version protected. Below her, in the alley, Damien said something to the 5 figures that made the 4 operational ones stop moving. Vane's voice came up to the rooftop. Not the words, but the cadence, the flat, unhurried cadence of a man who believes he is the conclusion of every argument before it starts. Elena looked at the phone in her hand. She opened the browser. She pulled up the address of the city's primary investigative journalism outlet, the one that had been running financial crime coverage for the past 4 years, the one that had published 6 stories on municipal corruption that had never quite reached the thing at the center, the thing her mother had found because they'd never had the documentation to reach it. She found the editor's direct submission contact. She photographed every page of the portfolio with the phone's camera, 12 pages, methodical, the same care her mother would have applied. She attached them to the email. Her thumb was over the send button. Below her in the alley, one of the 4 figures moved toward Damien. Her thumb pressed send. The phone registered transmission. All 12 attachments, delivered. She lowered the phone and looked at the alley and felt the specific, irreversible quality of something that cannot be taken back. The sensation of a lock turning, a door opening, a sequence of events being initiated that will run now regardless of what anyone in this alley does in the next 10 minutes or the next 10 years. Her mother's work was no longer in a basement archive or inside her memory or in a leather portfolio under one man's arm. It was everywhere. And the man in the suit at the south end of the alley was still standing there with 4 people around him who had been sent to retrieve something that was already gone, already moving through servers and networks at the speed of transmission, already in the hands of people whose job was to publish what powerful men wanted buried. And he didn't know it yet. She leaned over the edge of the roof and looked down at the alley. Damien was looking up at her, not because he'd heard anything, because he had been tracking her position on that rooftop with the same attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, which she was beginning to understand was a category with a very short list. She held up the phone. He looked at it for 1 second. Then he looked at the portfolio under her arm, the physical portfolio, the pages she'd photographed. And he looked back at her face. She held the portfolio out over the edge of the roof. His expression shifted. 1 degree, no more. But she caught it. The thing that moved through it. The thing she had been trying to name since the first night in the sitting room. The thing that functioned like recognition. Like the moment you understand that the person across from you has made the same calculation you made and arrived at the same answer independently. She let the portfolio fall. It dropped into the alley between Damien and the 5 figures and landed on the wet pavement, and the pages splayed open. 12 pages of Senator Aldrich Vane's financial architecture spread across the ground of a public alley in the Fenwick district. visible to every set of eyes present, including the security camera she had identified on the building's east face 14 minutes ago when they'd entered the alley and that she was now certain had been recording continuously. Vane's voice stopped. The alley was absolutely silent for 3 seconds. Then Vane said something to the 4 figures around him, sharp and low. And the 4 figures did not move toward Damien or toward the pages on the ground, but toward the vehicles. And Vane himself turned, and Elena watched from the rooftop as the man who had ordered her mother's death understood that the thing he had come here to prevent had already occurred, that the prevention window had closed, that what lived in those 12 pages was no longer suppressible by any means available to him. He got back in the vehicle. The vehicles reversed out of the alley's south end. Damien stood in the alley alone with the pages spread around him in the cold and the wet. And he looked up at the rooftop, and Elena looked down at him, and the distance between them was 40 feet of cold night air and 9 years of a promise kept in the most difficult possible way. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. And both of them understood that the part of this story they had been living inside, the part built on buried things and necessary silences and the long patience of people who understood that timing mattered more than speed, had just ended. What came next would be different. What came next would be theirs to build, rather than someone else's to destroy. But that was not yet. That was the next breath, and the one after, and the morning that would come after this night if they were careful, and if the transmission had reached the right hands, and if 9 years of her mother's work held up under the scrutiny it was about to receive. Elena looked at the phone in her hand. The sent confirmation was still on the screen. Delivered. All attachments. She looked at the staff member beside her. "We need to get down," she said. "Yes," he said. They went down. The pages were still on the alley floor when she reached the bottom of the fire escape. Damien had not moved from where she'd last seen him from the rooftop. He was standing at the midpoint of the alley with the 12 pages of Aldrich Vane's financial architecture spread around his feet like something shed, and the headlights from the south were gone, and the alley was back to its ordinary darkness, and he was looking at the pages with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the assessment, not the controlled burn, not the careful neutrality. Something older than all of those. Something that had been waiting a long time for this specific moment and was now in the process of understanding that the moment had arrived and did not feel the way long-anticipated things usually feel. She walked to where he was standing. She didn't say anything. She crouched down and began gathering the pages from the wet pavement, one at a time, straightening them against her knee, restoring their order. Her hands were cold. The pavement was wet enough to have darkened the lower corners of several pages, and she blotted them against her jacket without thinking about it. The automatic gesture of someone who has spent her life tending to things other people let fall. He crouched beside her after a moment and helped gather the remaining pages. Their hands were 6 inches apart on the wet ground. Neither of them spoke until the last page was collected. She stood. He stood. She held the pages. Her mother's work. 9 years held in a basement and inside her own memory, now also traveling through the digital infrastructure of a city at the speed of a sent email. He looked at what she was holding and then at her face, and the expression on his face was the expression she had been trying to name since the first night, and she was naming it now. It was grief that had been converted over a very long time into something load-bearing. The kind of grief that doesn't dissolve but learns to function as structure. She recognized it because she had been carrying the same kind for 9 years and hadn't known what to call it either. "She would have known you," Elena said. Came out quietly, without planning. "My mother. She would have understood you immediately." Damien looked at her for a moment. "She did," he said. "That was why she trusted me." They stood in the alley with that between them. The weight of a woman neither of them had been able to save and both of them had been trying to honor ever since. And the city moved around them with its ordinary indifference, and the cold pressed in from all directions. And neither of them moved toward the vehicles that were waiting or the next necessary thing, because there were 30 seconds available in this alley between what had just ended and what was about to begin, and both of them, without discussing it, were using them. Then Marcus's voice came through Damien's earpiece, audible from 2 feet away, and the 30 seconds were over. What followed was not the clean resolution that movies promise after the moment of decisive action. It was the hard, bureaucratic, exhausting work of consequence, the thing that comes after the thing, the part no one tells you about when they describe the turning point. It took 4 days for the journalism outlet to verify the documentation sufficiently to publish. It took 9 hours of those 4 days for Elena to sit in a secured location with 2 of their senior investigative staff and walk them through every element of the financial architecture her mother had built, explaining the indexing system, cross-referencing the archive documentation with the portfolio contents, answering questions with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the precision of this moment matters more than its speed. She did not sleep more than 4 hours on any of those 4 nights. She ate what was put in front of her. She drank too much coffee and not enough water. She kept the pages her mother had written in a manila envelope that she carried with her at all times. And at night, when she finally lay down, she put the envelope on the nightstand and looked at it in the dark. The way you look at something you need to know is still there. On the 3rd day, Carla arrived. She came through the door of the secured location, a hotel suite in the Aldermore district, unremarkable from the outside, as everything connected to this had been unremarkable from the outside. With 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner, and the expression of a woman who has been receiving information in pieces over 4 days, and has now assembled enough of the picture to be simultaneously furious and relieved, and something else that didn't have a clean name. She put 1 cup in front of Elena and sat down across from her. "You sent me 12 pages of evidence against a sitting senator," Carla said, "in an email from a number I didn't recognize." "I needed it somewhere safe," Elena said. "It went to my work email." "You're an attorney, attorney-client privilege. We don't have an attorney-client relationship. We have a friendship that predates any professional consideration, and you would have protected it anyway." Carla looked at her. The look contained approximately the same number of things as the expression at the wedding, but differently arranged. "You're okay," she said. It was not quite a question. "I'm okay," Elena said. It was not quite a full answer. Carla picked up her coffee. "Tell me everything, from the beginning, not the version you've been giving the journalists, the actual version." Elena told her everything. It took 2 hours. Carla did not interrupt except 3 times. Once when Elena got to the part about the document her father had signed. Once when Elena got to the part about her mother. And once, very briefly, when Elena got to the part about standing on the rooftop with the phone and the portfolio and making the decision to press send. At that 3rd interruption, Carla said nothing. She just set down her coffee cup and reached across the table and put her hand over Elena's hand and left it there for a moment, and then picked up her coffee again and said, "Keep going." Elena kept going. The publication ran the story on the morning of the 4th day. The headline was not sensational. The journalism outlet was not the sensational kind. They ran long, heavily documented pieces that moved slowly through institutional channels and tended to produce consequences that lasted rather than consequences that flared and died. The story ran to 6,000 words. It cited the documentation extensively. It named Senator Aldrich Vane by name in the 3rd paragraph and did not soften the naming. Elena was sitting with Damien in the suite's main room when the story went live. He had his phone. She had a laptop. They read it at the same time in silence, and when she finished, she set the laptop on the coffee table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. And when she looked back down, he was watching her. "She would have wanted to read this," Elena said. "Yes," he said. "She would have had notes. She would have found 3 things they'd gotten slightly wrong and been irritated about it." Something moved through his expression. Not the familiar assessment, something warmer and more private. "Probably," he said. They sat with the weight of that for a moment. Then Elena's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, and she had learned, over the past weeks, what it meant when she got calls from numbers she didn't recognize, so she answered it. It was her father. Thomas Ashcroft's voice was the voice of a man who had watched the news that morning and understood, in the way that even people who have spent decades refusing to understand things eventually understand them when the evidence becomes unavoidable. That the story published today was connected to his daughter in ways he had not accounted for when he had made his choices. He sounded older than 58. He sounded the way people sound when they have been running a particular kind of operation, the operation of not knowing things they know. For so long that when the operation fails, there's nothing underneath it. "Elena," he said. "Dad," she said. A long pause. She could hear him breathing. She let him breathe. "I didn't know about your mother," he said. "What she found, what she was working on. She never told me." "I know," Elena said. She did know. Margaret Voss had understood her husband's limitations with the precision of a woman who had loved him anyway, and had protected the work from him not out of distrust, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of what he was capable of carrying and what he wasn't. "The document I signed," he said, "when you were—" "I know about that too." Another pause. Longer. "I didn't understand what it meant," he said. "I want you to know that. I signed things I didn't read carefully because I was desperate, and I was ashamed, and I was—" He stopped. "That's not an explanation." "No," she said. "It's not." "I'm sorry," he said. It came out with the weight of a man saying something he has said before in lighter forms, and is saying now for the first time in its full weight. "Elena, I'm sorry." She sat with the phone against her ear and looked at the wall and thought about the elastic hope she had been watching her whole life. The expression that said she would find a way out because she always had. And she thought about what elasticity eventually does when it's been stretched past its limit for too long. "I know you are," she said. "I need you to stay out of the city for a while. Not forever. A while. There are going to be people looking for connections, and I need you somewhere they won't find you looking for leverage." "Elena, Dad, I'm handling this. I need you to let me handle it without having to handle you at the same time. Can you do that?" A pause. "Yes," he said quietly. "Okay," she said. "I'll call you when it's safe." She ended the call and set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. Damien had not appeared to listen, which meant he had listened to every word and had the discretion to not make that visible. She picked up her coffee. "He's not a bad man," she said. "He's a weak one. There's a difference." "Yes," Damien said. "The damage a weak man does is just as real as the damage a bad one does. But the remedy is different." She looked at the coffee. "I haven't figured out what the remedy is yet. For him." "You don't have to figure it out today." "No," she said. "I don't." The next 2 weeks moved at the pace of institutional consequence, which is slower and more grinding than the pace of crisis, but no less exhausting. Senator Aldrich Vane did not resign on the day the story ran. He released a statement through his office describing the documentation as fabricated and the journalists as operating in bad faith, which was the move of a man who had survived previous scrutiny by controlling the narrative and had not yet recalibrated for the difference between previous scrutiny and this. The difference was the completeness of the documentation, the cross-referencing between the financial records and the operational communications that had been in Carver's portfolio, the forensic chain that Margaret Voss had built with the specific intention that it be impossible to describe as fabricated by anyone who looked at it carefully. People looked at it carefully. The kind of people whose job was to look at things carefully and who had the institutional standing to make their conclusions consequential. On the 9th day after publication, 2 federal investigators arrived at Vane's office building. They did not arrive quietly. They arrived in the manner of people who had decided that quiet was no longer operationally relevant. Vane was taken into custody on the 14th day. The charges were read in a courthouse in the center of the city, in a room that was attended by more people than it was designed to hold, and Elena was not in that room. She was in the kitchen of the Fenwick District building, the building they'd retreated to the night of the alley, which had become a kind of operational base for the past 2 weeks. Making coffee and listening to the audio feed from the courthouse on her phone with one earbud in while she moved around the kitchen with the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands need to be doing something while her brain processes significant information. She heard the charges read. She heard Vane's attorney enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. She pulled out the earbud and finished making the coffee and poured 2 cups and carried them to the room where Damien was working through the operational implications of the network's exposure. The Serrano Group's financial infrastructure had been named in the same documentation, and the unwinding of that was a separate and complex process that was going to take considerably longer than 2 weeks. She put 1 cup on his desk. He looked up. He looked at her face. "Done," she said. He picked up the cup. He looked at it for a moment in the way that people look at something ordinary that has arrived at an extraordinary moment and carries both qualities simultaneously. "Not done," he said. "The Serrano Financial Network is going to take—" "I know," she said. "I mean, the piece that started this. The piece my mother started." She sat in the chair across from his desk. The chair she'd been sitting in for 2 weeks, across from a desk that had become hers to sit across from, in the way that things become yours through repeated occupation rather than formal assignment. "That piece is done." He looked at her. The expression on his face was the one she had finally named in the alley. The grief converted into load-bearing structure, and underneath it now something that had been released from load-bearing duty, something that didn't need to be structural anymore because the thing it had been holding up had been set down. "Yes," he said. "That piece is done." She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside the window, the city was conducting its ordinary morning. The sounds of traffic and movement, and people going about their business in the total ignorance of consequence, that is both the defining quality of ordinary life and its most necessary mercy. The thing with the Serrano network did take longer. It took 4 months of the kind of work that happens in rooms without windows, with attorneys and investigators and the painstaking reconstruction of financial architectures that had been designed to resist exactly this kind of reconstruction. Carver cooperated, which reduced the timeline considerably. His cooperation was not altruistic. It was the cooperation of a man who had understood, with precise clarity, that his value to the people he was now cooperating with was finite and time-limited and needed to be maximized before it expired. He gave them everything. The complete operational picture of 9 years of placement inside Damien's organization, every communication, every transferred document, every instruction received from Vane's network. He was, in the end, the most thorough witness the investigators could have asked for, because he had maintained the documentation of his own betrayal with the same professional care he'd applied to everything else. Elena sat in on 3 of the sessions with the investigators where Carver gave his account. Not because she needed to. The investigators didn't require her presence. But because she wanted to hear it. She wanted to sit in a room with Theo Carver and hear him describe, in full, the architecture of what had been done to her family. And she wanted to receive that information without flinching and without turning away. She received it. In the 3rd session, Carver looked at her at one point, across the table, across the investigators, and the legal counsel, and the recording equipment, and said, without being asked, "Your mother's work was the most complete piece of financial forensics I have ever encountered. In 8 years of trying to find a way to undermine it, I never succeeded." A pause. "I want you to know that." Elena looked at him. She thought about what the appropriate response was to a statement like that from a man like this, a statement that was true, and a compliment, and also, in some ways she couldn't fully articulate, a form of the accounting that people who have done significant damage eventually feel compelled to give, even when it costs them nothing and restores nothing. "I know," she said. "I've known my whole life." She didn't say anything else, and the session continued. The morning she understood that it was actually over. Not procedurally over, the legal process would run for years, but over in the way that mattered, the way that meant the specific danger that had shaped the past 4 months and the preceding 9 years had been sufficiently dismantled, was a Tuesday in early spring. She was in the archive 2 floors below the Fenwick building, returning the last of the documentation to its proper storage after the investigators had finished with the physical copies. And she was doing it alone, methodically, the way her mother had built the system in the first place, with attention, with care, with the understanding that the way you store things determines whether they're available when they're needed. She put the last file in its place. She stood back and looked at the shelving. Her mother's handwriting was on the interior label of the file at eye level. Margaret Voss, who had found something no one was supposed to find, who had made sure it would outlast her, who had chosen a man she trusted to hold one half and a daughter she loved to carry the other half without knowing she was carrying it. Elena put her hand flat on the file label. She stood like that for a moment, just standing. The way you stand when you finish something that has taken everything you had and you don't yet know what to do with your hands now that they're empty. Then she took her hand away and turned off the archive light and went upstairs. Damien was in the kitchen. He was making coffee, which she had discovered was one of the things he did when he was thinking through something he hadn't resolved yet. Stood in the kitchen and made coffee and stared at the counter and let his mind work at whatever the problem was. She had learned not to interrupt this process. She sat at the kitchen table and waited. He turned around with 2 cups, which meant he'd heard her come in, and set one in front of her and sat across from her. "The Serrano financial restructuring," he said. "I've been looking at the timeline." "How long?" she said. 18 months. Maybe 20 if the Eastern accounts are as complex as the investigators currently think. He looked at the coffee. "The legitimate side of the operation. The businesses that can survive the reorganization. I've been working with an attorney on a structural framework." She looked at him. "You're dissolving the rest." "I'm dissolving the parts that don't survive daylight." He said it without drama, without the weight of someone making a grand gesture. He said it the way you say something you decided a long time ago and have simply been waiting for the moment when saying it was accurate. The logistics infrastructure can be legitimate. The financial services, some of them can be reformatted. The rest, he paused, the rest is a cost. She thought about 41 people in his direct employ, about 200 more in the extended network, about the specific displacement that followed the structural change of something that had operated in one way for a long time. "Marcus," she said, "has been the head of a legitimate private security consultancy for the past 3 weeks on paper. The transition is administrative at this point." A pause. "He's aware. He's not unhappy about it." She thought about Marcus Hale with his weathered face and his 4-knock protocol and the cut above his left ear that had healed cleanly. She thought about Petra in the kitchen of the estate, 11 years of unconditional efficiency. She thought about the estate itself, which she had not been back to since the night they'd run through the east gate. "The house," she said. "Is yours if you want it," he said. He said it directly, without the careful engineering of a man constructing a proposition. "Or it isn't, if you don't. The choice doesn't affect anything else." She looked at him across the kitchen table in a building in the Fenwick district that had served as a base of operations and a place to sleep and a room for hard conversations, and had not in 4 months become anything other than what it was. She thought about the rooms on the 3rd floor of the manor, the sitting area, the bedroom, the closet with the space in it that didn't belong to her, the things placed there by someone who had tried to anticipate her needs without knowing exactly what they were. She thought about the east garden below her window, lit by security lights, the wall the 3 men had come over, the window she'd stood at when the glass broke. She thought about what it meant to belong to a place and what it meant to belong to a person, and what the difference was between belonging and being contained, and whether you could have the first without the risk of the second, and whether the risk was something that could be managed or simply something that had to be accepted as the cost of not being alone in the world. "I don't want the house," she said. He received this without visible adjustment, which was one of the things she had come to rely on in him. The ability to receive things as they were without requiring them to be different. "I want—" She stopped. She started again because she had learned that with him starting again was not weakness, it was accuracy. "I want to find a place that belongs to the next thing, not to any of what came before it." He looked at her steadily. "What is the next thing?" She thought about her mother's work, now in the hands of investigators and journalists and the institutional processes that would run it forward from here. She thought about the financial architecture she had spent 4 months learning, both her mother's version and Damien's version, and the places where the two overlapped and where they diverged, and what the overlapping revealed about the specific nature of money and power, and the systems people build to control both. She thought about what it meant to have a mind that had spent its whole life cleaning up after other people's damage, and what it would be like to redirect that mind towards something that built rather than repaired. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I want to figure it out from a place that's ours, not inherited from someone else's history." The word ours landed in the kitchen and occupied it. She had used it without planning to, and she sat with it for a moment to see whether it needed to be qualified or corrected, and decided it didn't. Damien looked at the coffee cup in his hands. He turned it slightly. He looked up. "I know a building," he said, "in the Aldermore district. The ownership is transferable. It's been used as something it wasn't designed for, and it's ready to be something else." She thought about the building in the Aldermore district where the wedding had been held. The wood paneling, the flowers in burgundy and rust that someone had selected with specific thought. The warmth of a space that had been made ready rather than merely occupied. "Show me," she said. He nodded. They finished the coffee. 3 weeks later, on a morning in late spring with the kind of light that arrives after a long winter and carries in it the specific relief of an absence ended, Elena stood in the empty main room of the building in the Aldermore district and looked at what it could be. The windows faced south, which meant the light moved through it over the course of the day rather than arriving and staying static. The floors were old wood that had been under something for years and were now uncovered and needed work but had good bones. The walls were the kind of walls that held whatever you put on them. Damien stood beside her. He was looking at the same room, and she understood from 4 months of learning how he looked at things that he was doing the same work she was, not imagining a finished version, but assessing the raw material, calculating what it could become if the right attention was given to it. She thought about her mother standing in a kitchen with a notebook and a cup of tea, saying something that sounded like a general principle and was actually a specific instruction. "There are numbers that matter, Ellie, not the ones people show you, the ones underneath." She thought about what that meant beyond the forensic architecture of a criminal financial network. She thought about what was underneath the visible structure of a life, the things that were load-bearing without announcing themselves, the things that looked like one thing and were doing the work of something else entirely. A memory game that was a filing system. A ring in a matte black box that carried 9 years of a kept promise. A marriage entered in fear that had become, through the specific alchemy of honesty applied under pressure, something that fit the word with more accuracy than she had thought the word was capable of holding. Carla had asked her, 2 weeks ago, over dinner at a restaurant in a neighborhood that was not associated with anyone or anything connected to the past 4 months. "How are you, actually? Not the operational update, not the status report. How are you?" Elena had thought about it. She had given it the consideration it deserved rather than the quick deflection she was practiced at producing. "I think I'm something I don't have a word for yet," she'd said. "I think I'm at the beginning of something that doesn't have a name because it hasn't happened before. Not for me." Carla had looked at her across the restaurant table with the expression of a woman who has known someone for long enough to be able to distinguish between the things they say and the things they mean. "That sounds right," Carla had said, and then, "He's good to you." Elena had thought about this too. Not whether Damien was good to her in the conventional sense. The question wasn't as simple as that, and Carla knew it wasn't. She thought about what good to someone meant when the someone in question had spent their entire adult life being the person who was good to others, the one who absorbed, who serviced, who cleaned up, who made the thing work. What it meant to be on the receiving end of a form of attention that was not soft and not performed and not designed to make you feel good so that you would stay, but was instead the attention of a person who saw you accurately and found what they saw worth protecting. "Yes," she had said, "he is." She had meant it with the particular weight of something earned rather than assumed. Now, in the empty room in the Aldermore district, she turned and looked at Damien beside her. He turned and looked at her. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary rhythms, indifferent and continuous, the way it had moved on the night she'd driven to a parking structure to save her father, and on the night she'd stood in an alley watching 12 pages fall from a rooftop, and on every night between and after those, the city itself a constant against which everything else changed. "It needs a lot of work," she said, about the room. "Yes," he said. "I know some people," she said, "with skills that are adjacent to renovation." Something moved through his expression, the thing she had named in the alley, and underneath it now, the thing that had been freed from load-bearing duty, and underneath that something she was still in the process of learning to read, because it was new. It had arrived recently. It had not been there in the early weeks and was there now with increasing frequency. Something that functioned like ease. Like a man discovering that the vigilance he had been sustaining for a very long time might not be required at the same level anymore, that some portion of his energy could be redirected towards something that was not defense. I have a few contacts, he said, who are exploring legitimate employment opportunities. She smiled. Not at the joke, though the joke was there. At what it represented. The specific quality of a conversation between two people who had moved past the part where they were assessing each other and into the part where they were simply talking. She looked at the room one more time. The south light. The floors with their good bones. The walls that held whatever you put on them. She thought about her mother, who had wanted a world that was cleaner than the one she'd found and had spent her life working toward that with the tools available to her. A notebook, a set of numbers, a trust placed in the right person. She thought about what it meant to continue that work, not forensically, not as accounting, but in the broader sense. The work of making something more honest than what came before it, of choosing, every day, the harder and more accurate thing over the easier and more comfortable one. She had not saved her father the way she thought she was saving him when she walked into that parking structure. She had saved him differently, had redirected the consequence that was coming for him, had bought him the space to understand what he'd done and live with that understanding rather than be erased by what he owed. That was not the salvation she had intended. It was possibly more durable than the one she'd planned. She had not married the man she thought she was marrying either. She had not married a monster or a captor or the embodiment of a debt her father couldn't pay. She had married someone who was carrying something too heavy to carry alone and had the integrity to say so without saying so, who had kept a promise made to a dead woman for 9 years because the alternative was a version of himself he wasn't willing to be. That was not the marriage she had agreed to in that room with the 14 chairs. It was the marriage that had grown in the soil of that one, which was what things do when the conditions are right and the people tending them don't give up. She had not become who she thought she would be either. She had thought, at some point, before the parking structure, before the ring box, before the alley and the rooftop and her mother's handwriting on a file label, that she was a person whose function was to absorb and repair and continue, that she was the one who fixed things at cost to herself because there was no one else, and that was what you did when there was no one else. She was still that person. She had not shed that. But she was also now the person who had pressed send, who had stood on a rooftop and made the irreversible choice and not flinched from it, who had sat in rooms with investigators and journalists and a man who had spent 6 years betraying everyone around him and had received all of it without being diminished by it. She was the architect of her own future. It had taken her 24 years and a parking structure and a forced marriage and her mother's ghost, and a man who had kept his word at enormous cost to arrive at that sentence. But she was here. She was in a room with good bones and south-facing light and a person beside her who saw her accurately. That was enough to begin with. That was, in fact, more than enough. She turned toward the door. "Come on," she said. "Show me the rest of it." He followed her. Behind them, the south light moved across the old wood floor, the way it would move across it every morning from here forward, slow and unconcerned and patient, the way light is patient, the way all the things that were here before us and will be here after us continue their business regardless. The light, the city, the stone of old buildings that have survived what they've survived and are still standing, holding whatever is placed inside them, asking nothing about what came before.